My husband stared down at me from the doorway of our home, wearing the expensive silk pajamas I bought for his birthday. He kicked my cheap suitcase out into the freezing rain and smiled a smile I did not recognize. "Your dad just left you a $4.7 million commercial real estate fortune," he whispered, his voice dripping with pure venom. "But after tonight, it is mine. Now get off my porch before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." Panic, irrational and swift, began to bubble up in my chest. I took a step back, squinting through the darkness at the door handle. The brass fixture looked different. It was shinier, newer. I ran my freezing fingers over the lock. The scratches and dents that had been there yesterday were gone. The locks had been changed. Suddenly, the clicking of the mouse stopped. I watched Robert's face. I saw the exact moment the color completely drained from his cheeks. His sharp gray eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He leaned closer to the screen, his mouth falling open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He did not say anything. He just stared at the digital records as if he were looking at a ghost. The silence stretched on, stretching my nerves to their absolute breaking point. I asked him what he saw. My voice was hoarse, barely more than a terrified whisper in the quiet room. Robert slowly turned his head to look at me. His expression was a mixture of professional shock and deep, visceral anger. He swallowed hard before he finally spoke. He told me that exactly 48 hours ago, a new set of legal documents had been electronically filed and officially recorded with the county clerk. My mind raced backward, doing the brutal math of the timeline. 48 hours ago, 2 days ago, my father had just suffered a massive cardiac event. He had been rushed to the intensive care unit. He was entirely unconscious, breathing through a ventilator, trapped in a deep medically induced coma. I was sitting on a plastic chair in the hospital corridor, sobbing into my hands, praying for a miracle. Richard had been there with me. He had patted my shoulder, offered me a cup of terrible hospital coffee, and then told me he needed to run home for a few hours to grab us some clean clothes and take care of the dog. Richard did not go home to get clean clothes. He went to execute the final fatal stage of his heist. Robert turned the large computer monitor around so I could see the screen. He pointed a trembling finger at the 2 digital documents listed at the very top of the property ledger. The first document was a general, durable power of attorney. The second document was a quitclaim deed. I stared at the bold black letters on the screen, feeling a wave of absolute nausea rise in my throat. As a financial professional, I knew exactly what those 2 documents meant when paired together. They were the ultimate legal weapons for transferring wealth quickly and quietly. Robert's voice was grim as he explained the horrific reality of the situation. He opened the digital file for the power of attorney. It was a comprehensive legal document that granted complete, unrestricted financial and legal authority over my father's affairs. It gave the designated agent the power to manage bank accounts, sign contracts, and most importantly, buy or sell real estate on my father's behalf. And right there on the bottom of the second page was the name of the appointed agent. Richard. My husband had somehow secured a document making him the absolute legal controller of my father's entire estate. But it was the second document that delivered the truly fatal blow. Robert clicked on the quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed is a specific type of real estate transfer. It does not offer any warranties or guarantees about the title. It simply transfers whatever ownership interest the current owner has directly to a new party. It is incredibly fast, requires very little verification compared to a standard warranty deed, and is almost exclusively used to transfer property quickly between trusted family members. Because it is an internal family mechanism, it rarely triggers immediate suspicion or red flags at the clerk's office. Richard had weaponized our marriage. He had weaponized his status as my husband and my father's son-in-law to bypass the standard legal scrutiny that would normally protect a $4.7 million commercial property. I read the details on the quitclaim deed, my eyes scanning the dry legalistic text that was systematically erasing my family's history. The document stated that my father, acting through his legally appointed agent, Richard, was willingly and entirely transferring his full ownership of the commercial plaza. The property was not transferred to Richard's personal name. Richard was far too calculating for that. A direct transfer to himself would be easily contestable in a divorce proceeding. Instead, the deed showed that the property had been transferred to a mysterious limited liability company. an LLC. My heart started to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knocked on the thick wood, the sound dull and muffled over the noise of the storm. "Richard," I called out, my voice cracking. Richard opened the door. "The key is not working." I waited, shivering violently, wrapping my arms around myself to ward off the biting cold. Nothing happened. The house remained silent and impenetrable. The name of the company was simple and completely untraceable at first glance. Apex Holdings, LLC. Robert sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He explained the sheer terrifying magnitude of the obstacle we were now facing. On paper, within the strict confines of the county legal system, this transaction looked completely legitimate. The clerk's office sees hundreds of quitclaim deeds filed every single week by family members managing estates for elderly parents. They look for valid signatures and proper notary stamps. If the paperwork appears correct on its face, they record it. Richard had presented a notarized power of attorney. He had signed the quitclaim deed as the authorized agent. He had paid the filing fees. The county had accepted it without a single question. Legally, as of 48 hours ago, my father no longer owned the commercial plaza he had spent 4 decades building. And because my father did not own it at the exact moment of his death last night, the property could not be passed down to me through his will. The will Robert held in his fireproof safe was now completely useless. It was a document dictating the transfer of an asset that no longer existed in my father's portfolio. Richard had essentially bypassed the entire probate process. He had stolen the property while my father's heart was still beating, ensuring that by the time I was a grieving orphan, I was also a destitute one. I sat in the leather chair, feeling the walls of the elegant law office closing in on me. The sheer psychopathic brilliance of Richard's plan was suffocating. He had not just cheated on me or hidden money in a secret bank account. He had orchestrated a flawless, legally binding corporate takeover of my inheritance. He had exploited my trust, my exhaustion, and my father's coma. He had used his position as a family member to slide right past the legal safeguards designed to protect vulnerable people. The evidence was glaring brightly on the computer screen. It was an ironclad, monumental obstacle. To the outside world, to a judge, to the county clerk, Richard was a dutiful son-in-law managing a complex real estate portfolio for a dying man. To me, he was a monster who had smiled in my face while sliding a knife directly into my back. But Richard had made one massive fundamental miscalculation. He believed that because he had successfully filed the paperwork, the war was over. He believed that I would collapse under the weight of the legal jargon, that I would accept defeat and walk away with nothing, just like he demanded on the porch. He forgot that I do not just read numbers. I dissect them. I am an auditor. I know that behind every fraudulent document, there is a trail of breadcrumbs. There is always a fake signature, a bribed notary, or a hidden bank transfer. I did not let the panic consume me. I looked away from the horrific quitclaim deed on the monitor and turned my gaze back to Robert. My tears were completely gone. My voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. I told Robert that Richard had just committed massive federal wire fraud, and I was going to prove it. I demanded that we immediately pull the state corporate registry. I needed to know exactly who was sitting behind the protective shield of Apex Holdings, LLC. I needed to know who was helping my husband steal my $4.7 million legacy. The legal system had been used to build a fortress around Richard's lies, but I was fully prepared to tear it down brick by brick. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair across from Robert. The revelation of the fraudulent quitclaim deed hung in the air between us like a physical weight. My father was lying in a hospital morgue, and my husband had just stolen his life's work. But the mind of an accountant does not allow for prolonged paralysis. A limited liability company is just a shell, a piece of paper filed with the state to shield the people standing behind it. I needed to know exactly who was standing behind Apex Holdings. I looked at Robert. His face was etched with a mixture of profound sorrow for my father and a sharp litigious fury. I told him to pull the state incorporation records for the LLC. I needed the names of the registered agents and the managing members. I needed to know who Richard was sharing this stolen fortune with. Robert nodded silently. His fingers flew across his keyboard. He opened a new tab and logged into the state's corporate division database. The rhythmic clicking of his mouth echoed in the quiet office. Every second felt like an eternity. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. I braced myself for the names of Richard's sleazy business partners, the men who had enabled his failed ventures in the past. I expected to see his brother or some shady contractor he owed money to. "Richard, please." I pounded harder, the side of my fist stinging from the impact. "Please open the door. My dad is gone. Richard, please." For a terrifying minute, I thought he might not be home. I thought I might have to sit on the freezing porch all night with the fresh grief of my father's death tearing me apart inside. But then a light flicked on in the hallway. I saw a shadow move behind the frosted glass of the front window. Robert stopped typing. He leaned closer to the monitor, his grey eyes narrowing as he read the official filing documents. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. He turned the monitor slightly toward me, his expression softening with a deep, pitying sorrow. "Sarah," he said gently, his voice thick with regret. "You need to prepare yourself for this. It is worse than we thought." I leaned forward and forced myself to look at the bright screen. The official state document listed the articles of organization for Apex Holdings. There were exactly 2 managing members listed as equal shareholders. The first name was Richard. The second name was Jessica. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. The room started to spin. I gripped the wooden edge of the desk to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. Jessica. The name burned into my mind like a brand. Jessica was a 24-year-old marketing assistant at the corporate firm where Richard used to work. She was young, vibrant, and always dressed in inappropriately tight clothes. Richard had introduced her to me 2 years ago at a company holiday party. He had draped his arm over her shoulder and laughingly told me that she was like a little sister to him. He called her his adopted sister. He claimed he was just mentoring her, helping her navigate the harsh corporate world because she reminded him of himself when he was young. I remembered all the times she had come over to our house for dinner. I remembered cooking her favorite meals, pouring her expensive wine, and listening to her ramble about her dramatic dating life. I remembered the way she would touch Richard's arm when she laughed at his jokes. I remembered the subtle, condescending smirks she would give me when I talked about my late nights doing freelance accounting work. She had looked at me not with the respect of a guest, but with the smug superiority of a woman who knew she was taking everything I had. Richard had played me for an absolute fool. He had brought his mistress into my home. He had fed her the food I cooked, and he had let her sit at the table paid for by my endless hours of auditing. And when his failed business ventures drained our bank accounts, it was not just bad luck. He was funneling my hard-earned money to her. The betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally vile, that it transcended the pain of infidelity. This was not a moment of weakness. This was a calculated, long-term strategy to bleed me dry and discard me. They had plotted this together. While I was sitting by my father's hospital bed holding his fragile hand and praying for him to wake up, Richard and Jessica were filing paperwork to steal his $4.7 million commercial plaza. I felt a wave of intense nausea wash over me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive back to that house, kick down the door, and demand to know how they could be so monstrous. I could picture them right now laughing in my living room, packing their bags and celebrating their massive victory. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully ruined my life and secured their own glamorous future. But the grief and the shock quickly gave way to a cold, razor-sharp fury. The tears that had been threatening to spill over my eyelids dried up instantly. I was no longer a heartbroken daughter or a betrayed wife. I was an auditor who had just found the smoking gun. Robert watched me closely, handing me a glass of cold water. He told me to breathe. He told me that we had the evidence we needed to start a massive civil lawsuit to reverse the deed transfer. He promised me we would fight this in court for as long as it took. But I shook my head. I knew Richard. I knew his financial habits and his desperate need for instant gratification. Richard would not steal a commercial property just to collect monthly rent checks. He hated managing tenants. He hated maintenance issues. He wanted liquid cash, and he wanted it immediately. The deadbolt clicked loudly. The handle turned, and the heavy door slowly swung open. I let out a sob of relief and stepped forward, ready to throw myself into my husband's arms, but I froze in my tracks. I looked at Robert and told him we were missing something. Richard and Jessica did not create an LLC just to hold the property. They created it to sell the property quickly and anonymously. I told Robert to search the commercial real estate listings. I told him to check the pending sales in the county database. I knew they were trying to liquidate the plaza. Robert hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by my sudden shift in demeanor, but he saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. He turned back to his computer and opened a specialized real estate portal used by attorneys and brokers. He typed in the parcel number for my father's plaza again. For a few agonizing minutes, the only sound in the office was the clicking of his mouse. Then Robert gasped. It was a sharp, inhaled breath of pure shock. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if he could not believe what he was seeing on the screen. "You are right, Sarah," Robert whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and horror. "They are not keeping it. They have already signed an agreement of sale." My heart pounded out against my ribs. I asked him for the details. I needed numbers. I needed facts. Robert pulled up a scanned copy of a commercial purchase agreement. It had been executed just 24 hours ago, mere hours after the fraudulent quitclaim deed had been filed. The seller was listed as Apex Holdings. The buyer was a massive out-of-state real estate development corporation known for buying up local properties, tearing them down, and building luxury condominiums. But it was the purchase price that made my blood run completely cold. My father's plaza had recently been officially appraised at $4.7 million. It was a prime piece of downtown real estate. It was a vibrant, fully occupied shopping center that anchored the local community. Robert pointed to the purchase price on the contract. Richard and Jessica were selling the entire plaza to the development corporation for $3.5 million. They were selling it for more than $1 million below market value. Why would they take such a massive loss? Robert asked, his legal mind struggling to comprehend the terrible financial decision. They are throwing away over $1 million. It makes absolutely no sense, but it made perfect sense to me. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. They are taking a massive loss because they need a fast all-cash closing. I explained, my voice eerily calm. They are giving the developers a fire sale price in exchange for waiving all inspections, all financing contingencies, and all standard waiting periods. They want liquid cash, and they want it before anyone realizes my father is dead and the deed is forged. Robert's eyes widened in a realization. He quickly scrolled down to the final pages of the purchase agreement, searching for the closing date. When he found it, the remaining color drained entirely from his face. "Sarah," Robert said, his voice tight with urgency. "The closing is scheduled for this Friday at 9 in the morning." I looked at the clock on Robert's wall. It was Wednesday morning. That meant we had exactly 48 hours. 48 hours. 2 days. That was all the time standing between me and the total irreversible loss of my family's legacy. Robert explained the catastrophic reality of the timeline. In exactly 48 hours, Richard and Jessica would walk into a title company office. They would sign the final closing disclosures. The Real Estate Development Corporation would wire $3.5 million in clean, untraceable cash directly into the bank account of Apex Holdings. Once that money hits their account, Robert warned, his tone grim and serious. They will immediately wire it to an offshore bank in a country with no extradition treaty. They will pack their bags, drive to the airport, and disappear overseas. You will never see that money again, Sarah. And because the development corporation bought the property in good faith, getting the plaza back through the courts could take years of litigation, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees that you do not have. Richard stood in the doorway, blocking the threshold with his body. He was not rushing to comfort me. He was not looking at me with the tender, worried eyes of a loving partner. He stood tall and perfectly composed, his hair neatly combed. He was wearing the dark blue, expensive silk pajamas I had saved up to buy him for his birthday just last month. He looked incredibly comfortable, incredibly warm, and entirely untouched by the tragedy of the night. If the cash was released, Richard and Jessica would win. They would escape with millions, living a life of luxury on a tropical beach, financed entirely by my father's sweat and my own stolen savings. They would leave me behind in Pennsylvania, a destitute, grieving widow with nothing but a worthless piece of paper and a mountain of legal debts. The thought of Jessica, the girl who had smiled at me over my own dining table, spending my father's hard-earned money on designer bags and first-class plane tickets, made my stomach churn. The thought of Richard, the man who had thrown my clothes into the freezing mud, walking away completely unpunished, was a physical agony. My father had worked his entire life to build that plaza. He had missed vacations and worked through illnesses to secure a future for me. He had trusted me to protect his legacy. I could not, and I would not, let two greedy, soulless monsters tear it all down. "We have to stop the transaction," I said. My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble. The pain of betrayal had burned away, leaving behind a core of solid, indestructible titanium. "We have to stop them before that wire transfer goes through." Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on his desk. "We can file an emergency injunction with the civil court," he suggested. "We can try to get a judge to put a temporary restraining order on the sale, but civil courts are slow, Sarah. Finding a judge willing to halt a multi-million-dollar commercial transaction based on allegations of forgery within 48 hours is incredibly risky. If the judge delays the ruling, even by one day, the money will be gone." I shook my head. I knew the civil route was a gamble we could not afford to take. A simple restraining order was not enough. I did not just want to stop the sale. I wanted Richard and Jessica to pay for what they had done. I wanted them to experience the exact same absolute terrifying loss of control that they had forced upon me. I am an accountant. I know that the most powerful weapon against financial fraud is not a slow-moving civil lawsuit. It is the swift, devastating hammer of federal law enforcement. Richard had crossed state lines by selling property to an out-of-state corporation using digital wire communications. He had committed federal wire fraud. "We are not going to civil court, Robert," I told him, standing up from my chair. I looked down at the brilliant, seasoned attorney, my mind working 10 steps ahead. "If we file a civil suit now, Richard will be notified. He will panic, he will drain whatever funds he already has, and he will run before the police can ever catch him. We are not going to warn him." Robert looked up at me, his eyes reflecting a mixture of confusion and growing respect. "Then what are we going to do?" "Sarah, the clock is ticking. We are going to let them think they have won," I said, my voice echoing with absolute resolve in the quiet office. "We are going to let Richard and Jessica put on their expensive clothes and walk into that closing room on Friday morning. We are going to let them sit at that table and pick up their pens to sign the final documents." I picked up the manila envelope containing my father's true will and the evidence of the fraudulent quitclaim deed. I held it tightly against my chest, and while they are smiling and waiting for their $3.5 million wire transfer, I continued my gaze locking with Robert's. "We are going to make sure the Federal Bureau of Investigation is standing right outside the door." Richard I gasped, my teeth chattering. "What is going on? Why did you change the locks, my dad?" "Richard, he passed away. He is gone." I waited for his face to soften. I waited for him to reach out and pull me inside out of the freezing rain. Instead, the corners of his mouth twitched upward into a cold, terrifyingly empty smile. He did not move an inch. He simply stared down at me as if I were a stranger soliciting at his door. The war for my father's legacy was no longer about simple grief or heartbreak. It was about absolute uncompromising justice. Richard and his mistress had 36 hours left of their stolen fantasy, and I was going to spend every single one of those hours ensuring that their glamorous escape ended in a pair of cold steel handcuffs. I walked out of Robert Hayes' law firm and stepped back into the cold Pennsylvania morning. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and gray under the overcast sky. Robert was an incredible lawyer, and I knew he was already marshalling his extensive resources. He was preparing the federal injunctions and reaching out to his high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But the legal system is a massive, slow-moving machine. Even with expedited emergency filings, getting a judge to review a case, sign protective orders, and issue subpoenas takes a considerable amount of time. Time was the one luxury I absolutely did not possess. I had less than 48 hours before Richard and his mistress Jessica closed the deal on my father's commercial plaza. Once that real estate corporation wired the $3.5 million into their shell company account, the money would vanish overseas. I could not just sit in my car and passively wait for the lawyers to do their job. I'm a certified public accountant. I have spent my entire adult life learning how capital moves. I know that money moves significantly faster than the law ever could. I drove my old Honda Civic 2 blocks down the street and parked in front of a small, quiet coffee shop. I needed a secure internet connection and a secluded corner where I could work without any interruptions. I walked inside, ordered a plain black coffee, and found a small wooden table tucked away in the back of the room. I opened my laptop and connected to the wireless network. My hands were perfectly steady now. The crushing grief of losing my father had been carefully compartmentalized. I had locked the sorrow away in a tight box deep inside my mind so I could focus entirely on doing what needed to be done. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the login page for the primary joint checking account I shared with Richard. This was the specific bank account where I had faithfully deposited every single paycheck I had earned from my freelance accounting business for the past 7 years. This was the account Richard consistently used to fund his endless string of failed startup ideas and his expensive networking dinners. I typed in my username and password, my fingers moving automatically across the keys. My heart skipped a beat as the blue loading wheel spun on the screen. I half expected a bold red error message to pop up telling me the password had been changed or the account had been officially frozen by the primary account holder. Richard was incredibly greedy and he had orchestrated a brilliant real estate heist, but he was also profoundly lazy when it came to daily administrative tasks. He had somehow overlooked the most basic step of financial separation. He had not locked me out. The dashboard loaded, displaying our financial life in stark black and white. I looked at the available checking balance. It read exactly $15,240. That was it. That was the sum total of 7 years of my grueling, exhausting hard work. Richard had steadily drained almost everything else to secretly fund his double life with Jessica and to cover the initial setup costs for his fraudulent real estate company. I did not hesitate for a single second. I opened a new browser tab, logged into a highly secure individual savings account I had opened under my maiden name years ago, and initiated an immediate wire transfer. I typed in the full amount, transferring every last penny and leaving exactly $0.00 in the joint checking account. I hit the confirm button. A green checkmark appeared brightly on my screen. The money was officially gone. I had taken back the last remaining scraps of my own financial security. It was a relatively small victory compared to the massive theft of my father's plaza, but it was the very first blow I had landed in this war. But I was not finished. I did not just want my $15,000 back. I wanted the exact blueprint of his fraud. I clicked on the transaction history tab and downloaded the last 6 months of banking statements into a detailed raw spreadsheet file. I opened the file in my accounting software and began to filter the massive amount of data. To a normal person, a raw bank statement is just a confusing, overwhelming wall of numbers, dates, and vendor codes. But to a seasoned auditor, it is a perfectly clear map of a person's life and their deepest secrets. Money always leaves a permanent, undeniable trail. I quickly formatted the columns, expanding the descriptions and organizing the transactions by date and amount. I could clearly see exactly when Richard started taking Jessica to expensive downtown steakhouses, hiding the charges under the guise of legitimate client dinners. I could see the sudden, uncharacteristic influx of large cash withdrawals from automated teller machines located in the specific neighborhood where Jessica rented her apartment. But I ignored all of those emotional betrayals. Infidelity was deeply painful, but cheating on your spouse was not a federal financial crime. I needed the concrete financial breadcrumbs that directly connected Richard to the fraudulent quitclaim deed and the rapid creation of his shell company. I sorted the spreadsheet by transaction amount, strictly focusing on anything over $1,000. I specifically narrowed my search to the weeks immediately preceding my father's massive heart attack. Richard had been incredibly busy moving money while I was entirely distracted by my father's declining health. "I heard you the first time," he said. His voice was steady, smooth, and completely devoid of any human empathy. It sliced through the cold air sharper than the rain. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his reaction. "You heard me?" I asked, confusion battling with the rising panic in my gut. "Then let me in. I am freezing. I need to sit down." My eyes scanned down the brightly lit columns of debits. Then a very specific transaction jumped out at me like a flashing red siren. It was a direct wire transfer executed exactly 10 days ago. The amount was exactly $10,000. I looked at the memo line attached to the transfer by the bank. Richard had manually typed the words administrative service fee into the payment description. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed softly in the quiet coffee shop. Richard had never paid a legitimate administrative service fee in his entire life. I was his administrator. I handled every single piece of complex paperwork, tax filing, and payroll processing for his businesses completely for free. He would never voluntarily spend $10,000 of our money on administrative work unless he was buying something highly illegal. I scrolled across the spreadsheet to see the name of the recipient account. The name listed on the wire transfer confirmation was Thomas. The air in my lungs suddenly felt very thin. Thomas was Richard's brother-in-law. He was married to Richard's older sister. He was a man I had thoroughly and consistently despised since the very first day I met him. Thomas was chronically unemployed, perpetually full of pathetic excuses, and completely addicted to high-stakes sports gambling. He was the kind of man who was always cornering Richard in the kitchen at family Thanksgiving dinners, desperately begging for a temporary loan to cover a supposedly sure-thing bet. I had spent years strictly warning Richard not to give Thomas a single dime of our money. But now, the official bank records proved that my husband had secretly wired this gambling addict $10,000 of my hard-earned money right before orchestrating the theft of my father's commercial plaza. Why would Richard pay Thomas $10,000? Thomas was not a corporate lawyer. He was not a licensed real estate broker. He was not a title agent. He had absolutely no professional skills that would ever warrant a massive consulting fee. I stared at the bright screen, my mind rapidly connecting the disparate dots with terrifying speed. Thomas held only one official legally recognized credential. Years ago, before his severe gambling addiction completely destroyed his professional career and his credit score, Thomas had worked as a low-level manager at a small local community bank. To keep that specific job, the bank had required him to obtain a specific legal license from the state. He had studied for the exam, passed the background check, and successfully become a registered notary public. Even after he was fired from the bank, he kept his official notary stamp active and his license renewed. He frequently bragged about how he occasionally used it to make $20 here and there, stamping questionable auto titles and informal contracts for his shady friends in the neighborhood. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. You cannot simply file a quitclaim deed or a general durable power of attorney transferring a $4.7 million commercial property without a verified notary signature and a physical notary stamp. The county clerk's office strictly requires that official state-sanctioned seal. The notary stamp is the ultimate legal proof that the person signing the document is exactly who they claim to be, and that they are signing the document of their own free will and with sound mind. My father had been lying in a hospital bed trapped in a deep medically induced coma. He could not have signed anything. He could not have authorized Richard to act as his legal agent. Richard needed someone to look the other way. He needed a registered notary public who was desperate enough for quick cash to stamp a clearly forged document and swear under penalty of perjury that my father had signed the papers while fully conscious and aware. He needed someone with absolutely no moral compass, someone drowning in massive gambling debt, and someone who would keep their mouth shut to protect the family. He needed Thomas. Richard had used our joint bank account to pay a $10,000 bribe to his own brother-in-law to secure the fraudulent notary stamp. It was the crucial key that unlocked the entire heist. Without Thomas stamping those papers, the county clerk would have rejected the quitclaim deed immediately. The $4.7 million property transfer would have never occurred. By paying Thomas that money, Richard had officially elevated his scheme from a simple domestic betrayal into a massive multi-person criminal conspiracy. I took a screenshot of the $10,000 wire transfer. I downloaded the official bank confirmation receipt, ensuring that the date, time, and routing numbers were perfectly captured. I saved the files directly to my encrypted external hard drive. This was the exact type of concrete, irrefutable financial evidence the Federal Bureau of Investigation needed to issue immediate arrest warrants. The civil courts might be slow, but federal prosecutors move with terrifying speed when presented with documented wire fraud and a bribed state official. I closed my laptop and slid it back into my bag. I had secured my remaining $15,000, and I had discovered the exact mechanism Richard used to bypass the law. I knew exactly who the players were. Richard was the mastermind, Jessica was the willing accomplice and beneficiary, and Thomas was the desperate, bribed notary who facilitated the entire fraud. They thought they had perfectly executed the crime of the century. They thought they were 48 hours away from stepping onto a plane with $3.5 million of my father's money. But they had left a perfectly clear paper trail, and I was going to hand that trail directly to the authorities. I stood up, left my cold coffee on the table, and walked out of the shop, ready to dismantle their lives. The heavy mahogany doors of Robert Hayes' law office felt like a fortress against the outside world. I sat back down in the plush leather chair across from his desk. The air in the room was thick with tension. I had just shown Robert the bank statement proving Richard wired $10,000 to his brother-in-law Thomas. Robert looked at me with his sharp grey eyes. He asked me what I was thinking. I told him that every single real estate transfer in the United States requires a notary public seal. It is the absolute bedrock of property law. A notary must verify the identity of the person signing the document and confirm they are acting of their own free will. My father was in a deep coma. He could not have signed anything. I leaned forward and asked Robert to pull up the digital copy of the quitclaim deed one more time. He let out a short, cynical laugh. It was a sound I had never heard him make in the 7 years we had been together. He reached behind him into the hallway and dragged something forward. It was my suitcase, the cheap, scuffed piece of luggage I used for weekend trips. He hoisted it up and, with a casual flick of his wrist, tossed it directly at me. Robert turned his monitor back toward me. He clicked on the scanned document. I told him to zoom in on the bottom right corner of the second page. The image on the screen enlarged, bringing the black ink into sharp focus. There it was. The official circular stamp of a registered notary public. We leaned in closer to read the name printed inside the seal. Thomas Vance. The name stared back at me, confirming every single dark suspicion I had. Conflict erupted in my chest, a volatile mix of absolute rage and vindication. Robert slumped back in his chair. His face went completely pale. He told me that this was an unbelievable level of corruption. He explained that Richard had used his own family connections to seize legally owned property on paper. Richard had paid Thomas $10,000 to stamp a forged document while my father lay dying. The evidence was right there in the county legal system. It created a massive obstacle because on paper, the transaction looked entirely legitimate. But to me, it was the exact key I needed to tear Richard down. I stood up and grabbed my purse. Robert asked me where I was going. He warned me that we needed to take this to the police. He said we needed to let the authorities handle the fraud investigation. I shook my head firmly. I told Robert we did not have time for the police to build a case. The real estate corporation was wiring $3.5 million to Richard and Jessica in exactly 48 hours. If we waited for detectives to secure warrants and conduct interviews, that money would be gone forever. Richard and Jessica would be on a plane to a country with no extradition treaty. I told Robert I was going to handle Thomas myself. I knew Thomas better than any detective ever could. I knew his weaknesses. I knew he was currently drowning in massive gambling debt. I knew he was a coward who would shatter under the slightest amount of real pressure. I walked out of the law firm and got back into my cold car. The rain had started to fall again, drumming a steady, relentless rhythm against my windshield. I put the car in drive and headed toward the east side of the city. Thomas lived in a dilapidated apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district. It was a bleak, decaying neighborhood filled with crumbling brick buildings and cracked sidewalks. It was a world away from the pristine, thriving commercial plaza my father had spent 40 years building. My father had earned every penny of his wealth through honest, back-breaking labor. Thomas had spent his entire life looking for shortcuts, begging for handouts, and placing terrible bets on football games. And now he had dared to participate in the theft of my family legacy. I parked my car across the street from his building. The exterior paint was peeling in large gray strips. The front security door was propped open with a broken brick. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs. The hallway smelled strongly of stale beer-damp carpet and old cigarette smoke. I reached apartment 3B. I did not hesitate. I raised my fist and pounded heavily on the peeling wooden door. I waited a few seconds and pounded again, louder this time. I heard the sound of shuffling feet inside. The deadbolt clicked and the door cracked open just a few inches. Thomas peered out at me through the narrow gap. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken. His hair was a greasy mess. He was wearing a stained white t-shirt and sweatpants. When he recognized my face, a flash of pure panic crossed his features. He tried to slam the door shut, but I was faster. I shoved my shoulder against the heavy wood and pushed my way inside the apartment. Thomas stumbled backward, completely caught off guard by my physical force. I stepped into his living room and looked around in absolute disgust. The place was a disaster. The coffee table was covered in empty beer bottles and crumpled bedding slips. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the daylight. It was the perfect, pathetic sanctuary for a guilty man. I turned to face him. My posture was rigid. My expression was colder than ice. Thomas stuttered, asking me what I was doing there. He tried to sound angry, but his voice was shaking uncontrollably. I told him to sit down. I did not yell. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, which only terrified him more. I walked over to his cheap dining table and pulled out one of the rickety chairs. I sat down and placed my leather purse on the table. I opened my bag and slowly pulled out my manila envelope. I told Thomas that I knew exactly what he did 48 hours ago. I told him I knew Richard had paid him to forge a notary seal on a quitclaim deed. Thomas shook his head violently. He started backing away toward the kitchen. He denied everything. He claimed he had no idea what I was talking about. He told me I was crazy and demanded that I leave his apartment immediately. I ignored his pathetic protests. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the enlarged high-resolution printout of his notary seal from the deed of transfer. I slammed it down onto the wooden table. The sound echoed in the quiet room. I told him his official name and state registration number were permanently inked on a document transferring a $4.7 million commercial property. Then I pulled out the bank statement. I placed it right next to the forged deed. I pointed to the highlighted row showing the $10,000 wire transfer from Richard to his personal checking account. I told him I was a certified public accountant. I explained that bank transfers are federal records. They cannot be erased. They cannot be hidden. The money trail was absolute and irrefutable. Thomas stared at the papers on the table. The remaining color drained completely from his face. He began to sweat profusely. He wiped his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was realizing that his clever little shortcut had left a massive glowing footprint. The suitcase hit the wet concrete of the porch with a heavy thud. The faulty latch snapped open upon impact, spilling my few inexpensive blouses, a pair of worn-out jeans, and my toothbrush out into the muddy puddles forming on the ground. My breath caught in my throat. I looked down at my soaked clothes, then up at the man standing in the warm, dry entryway. "Richard, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Have you lost your mind?" But I was not finished. I pulled out my mobile phone. I told him that right before Richard locked me out of my house, he had bragged about taking the plaza. I told Thomas I had recorded that entire confrontation on my front porch. I pressed play on the audio file. Richard's arrogant, cruel voice filled the small apartment. Richard's voice clearly stated that the property was his now, and that the legal paperwork was perfectly arranged. I paused the recording and looked up at Thomas. I told him that Richard had already thrown him under the bus. I told him that Richard and Jessica were planning to take $3.5 million in cash and flee the country by Friday morning, leaving Thomas behind to take the entire fall for the forged documents. Thomas gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. His breathing became rapid and shallow. He looked at the bank statement, the forged deed, and my phone. The walls of his miserable reality were crashing down around him. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I decided it was time to deploy the final devastating blow. I decided to explain the law to him in excruciating detail. I told Thomas that stamping a forged signature on a local auto title was a misdemeanor. I told him that colluding to steal a commercial real estate property valued at nearly $5 million was a massive federal crime. I explained that because the transaction involved electronic bank transfers and out-of-state corporate buyers, he had committed federal wire fraud. I kept my voice perfectly level as I outlined the sentencing guidelines. I told him that federal wire fraud carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I told him there was no early parole in the federal system. I told him he would spend the next 15 years of his life in a concrete cell surrounded by violent criminals, far away from his family and his gambling habits. I watched his psychological defenses shatter into a million pieces. The threat of a decade and a half in federal prison was too much for his weak, addicted mind to process. He began to shake violently. Tears welled up in his bloodshot eyes and spilled over his cheeks. His knees actually buckled. He sank down onto the dirty linoleum floor of his kitchen, pulling his knees to his chest. He looked like a terrified, broken child. He started sobbing loudly. He begged me not to go to the police. He begged me not to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He told me he was drowning in debt. He explained that his bookies were threatening to break his legs if he did not pay them back by the end of the week. He said Richard came to him with a briefcase full of cash and a simple piece of paper. Richard had promised him that it was just a family matter, that it was perfectly safe, and that no one would ever investigate a transfer between a father and a son-in-law. I asked him exactly what happened in the hospital room. My voice was unrelenting. I needed the full, unvarnished truth for the legal record. Thomas kept his face buried in his hands as he confessed everything. His voice was muffled by his tears, but the horrific details were crystal clear. He told me that Richard had driven him to the hospital during the early hours of the morning while I was down in the cafeteria getting coffee. He said they walked into the intensive care unit. My father was lying in the bed hooked up to the ventilator, completely unconscious. Thomas sobbed harder as he described the scene. He said Richard took a pen and physically placed it into my father's limp, unresponsive hand. Richard then wrapped his own hand around my father's fingers and forced him to trace a jagged, barely legible signature onto the general durable power of attorney and the quitclaim deed. Thomas stood right there at the foot of the hospital bed and watched the entire desecration happen. He watched Richard manipulate a dying man. And then for $10,000, Thomas took his official state notary stamp out of his pocket and pressed it onto the forged pages. He officially certified that my father was of sound mind and had signed the documents willingly. The sheer depravity of the act made my stomach churn. My father had been a good, honorable man. He had treated Richard like a son. And in his final, most vulnerable moments on earth, Richard and Thomas had treated him like a piece of garbage to be discarded for cash. The anger burning inside me was hotter than the surface of the sun, but I did not let Thomas see my rage. I only let him see my absolute authority. I stood up from the wooden chair. I looked down at the miserable weeping man on the floor. I told him that Richard had used him. I told him that Richard and Jessica were going to disappear and leave him holding the bag for a federal conspiracy. I told him that the federal prosecutors would show absolutely no mercy to a notary public who violated his oath to steal from a dying man. I let that terrifying reality sink into his brain for a few long, agonizing seconds. Then I offered him a lifeline. I told Thomas that I held his entire future in the palm of my hand. I told him I had the bank records, the forged deed, and now his full verbal confession. I could walk out of his apartment, drive straight to the district attorney office, and have him arrested before dinner. Or he could choose to save himself. I told him there was only one way to avoid spending the next 15 years in a federal prison cell. His eyes, usually a warm hazel, were completely dead. They were the eyes of a shark looking at a bleeding fish. I am cleaning house. Sarah, he replied smoothly, leaning against the doorframe, and it is time to take out the trash. I demanded his total, unconditional cooperation. I told him he was going to come with me to Robert Hayes' law office. He was going to sit down in front of a certified legal stenographer and sign a sworn notarized affidavit detailing exactly what Richard forced him to do in that hospital room. He was going to surrender his notary logbook. And when the time came, he was going to stand up in a court of law and testify as my star witness against Richard and Jessica. Thomas looked up at me. His face was soaked with tears and sweat. He was completely defeated. The defiance was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, clinging need for survival. He nodded his head frantically. He agreed to everything I demanded. He swore he would testify. He swore he would sign whatever documents my lawyer put in front of him. He thanked me over and over again for giving him a chance to stay out of prison. I felt a cold, profound sense of satisfaction wash over my heart. The second pillar of Richard's criminal enterprise had just collapsed. Richard believed he had orchestrated a flawless, airtight heist. He thought he had outsmarted the legal system, my father and me. He thought the $10,000 bribe had secured Thomas's loyalty forever. He severely underestimated the absolute fragility of a coward. I told Thomas to get up from the floor. I told him to put on a clean shirt and grab his notary logbook. We did not have a single minute to waste. The clock was ticking relentlessly toward the Friday morning closing date. Richard and Jessica were currently busy planning their luxurious escape, packing their bags, and dreaming of the millions they were about to steal. They had no idea that I had just weaponized their own accomplice against them. They had no idea that the silent, grieving widow they had underestimated was actively dismantling their entire world. I picked up my manila envelope, sliding the bank statements and the enlarged seal safely back inside. I walked toward the apartment door, leaving Thomas to scramble frantically behind me. The air outside was still cold and damp, but as I stepped back onto the broken sidewalk, I felt completely invincible. The truth was finally in my hands, and justice was coming for them with the unstoppable force of a hurricane. I drove Thomas back to the law firm of Robert Hayes in complete silence. The rain beat against the windshield of my car, but the atmosphere inside the vehicle was entirely dead. Thomas sat in the passenger seat shivering and staring out the window with the blank, terrified expression of a man who knew his life was effectively over. He smelled of stale beer and cold sweat. I kept my eyes focused on the road ahead. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute certainty. The chaotic, blinding grief of losing my father had crystallized into a singular, sharp purpose. I was going to dismantle my husband's life, and I was going to use his own greedy accomplices to do it. When we walked back through the heavy glass doors of the law office, Martha, the receptionist, took one look at Thomas and immediately picked up her phone. Robert stepped out of his corner office a moment later. He saw the miserable, defeated man standing beside me and understood exactly what I had accomplished. I told Robert that Thomas was ready to tell the truth. I told him we needed a certified legal stenographer in the room right this second. Robert did not ask any questions. He simply nodded, pointed to the large conference room down the hall, and told us to go inside. The conference room was imposing, featuring a massive oak table and tall leather chairs. Thomas sank into one of the chairs, looking incredibly small and pathetic in the elegant corporate setting. A few minutes later, a professional stenographer hurried into the room, setting up her machine at the end of the table. Robert sat next to me, sliding a fresh legal pad in front of him. I looked across the table at Thomas. I told him to start from the beginning and not to leave out a single detail. I reminded him that this sworn testimony was his only shield against a massive federal prison sentence. Thomas began to speak. The stenographer's fingers flew quietly across her keys, capturing every single word of his confession. He detailed how Richard had approached him a week ago, knowing he was desperate to pay off his dangerous gambling debts. He explained how Richard had promised him $10,000 for a simple favor. Then his voice broke as he recounted the early morning hours in the intensive care unit. He described walking into my father's hospital room. He described the harsh fluorescent lights and the rhythmic hissing of the ventilator. He told the room exactly how Richard had taken a blue ink pen, placed it into my father's unconscious hand, and physically manipulated his fingers to forge a jagged signature on the general durable power of attorney and the quitclaim deed. Thomas wept openly as he admitted to pulling out his official state notary stamp and pressing it onto those forged documents, permanently destroying his own legal oath for a small stack of cash. Watching him confess to the stenographer, I felt a deep, profound sickness in my stomach. The sheer callousness of what they had done to my dying father was monstrous. But as the certified transcript was printed and Thomas signed his name at the bottom of the sworn affidavit, the sickness was quickly replaced by a powerful surge of vindication. We finally had the smoking gun. We had the ultimate proof that the real estate transfer was a complete and total fraud. The rhythmic, agonizing sound of the heart monitor flatlining was still echoing in my ears as I drove down the dark Pennsylvania highway. The cold, relentless rain lashed against the windshield of my old Honda Civic, the worn-out wipers struggling to push the heavy sheets of water away. It was past midnight. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the crushing, suffocating weight sitting on my chest. The sheer cruelty of his words hit me harder than a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was the man I had married, This was the man I had sworn to stand by in sickness and in health. For 7 years, I had poured every ounce of my energy, my youth, and my financial expertise into him. Robert took the signed affidavit and carefully placed it into a secure file. He looked at me, his grey eyes shining with a mixture of professional respect and fierce determination. He told me that this confession changed everything. He said we now had the legitimate legal ammunition to stop the $3.5 million sale. Robert explained the immediate legal counterattack. He told me he was going to file an emergency application for a lis pendens directly with the county court. He saw the question in my eyes and quickly translated the legal jargon. A lis pendens is a formal public notice of pending litigation. It is a highly powerful legal tool that acts like a flashing red siren on a piece of real estate. Once a lis pendens is officially recorded against a property title, it warns any potential buyer, bank, or title company that the ownership of the property is currently under a severe legal dispute. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. He explained that if the Real Estate Development Corporation tried to close the deal on Friday morning, their title insurance company would run a final background check on the property. They would instantly see the lis pendens. No legitimate corporation in the United States would ever hand over $3.5 million in cash for a property burdened with an active fraud lawsuit. The title company would immediately freeze the transaction. It was a brilliant silent landmine. It legally protected my father's commercial plaza without requiring us to physically confront Richard right away. I watched as Robert turned to his computer and began furiously typing up the emergency legal filings. Within 20 minutes, he had electronically submitted the lis pendens application to the county clerk, backed by the explosive sworn affidavit from our terrified notary public. The clerk's office processed emergency injunctions quickly. The trap on the property title was officially set. The commercial plaza was locked down. Robert leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me and smiled a grim, satisfied smile. He told me the property was safe. He said that on Friday morning, the real estate developers would walk away from the table and Richard's massive payday would instantly evaporate. Robert then reached for his desk phone. He told me it was time to call the local police precinct. He said we needed to file a formal police report for forgery and elder abuse so the local detectives could go arrest Richard at the house. I reached across the desk and gently placed my hand over the phone receiver. I stopped him from making the call. Robert looked at me in total confusion. I looked back at him, my mind operating with the cold, calculating precision of a senior auditor. I told Robert that calling the local police was a terrible mistake. Local detectives handling domestic disputes and estate fraud are often overworked and slow to act. If a uniformed police officer simply knocked on Richard's door to ask questions, it would immediately alert him that the scheme had failed. Richard would panic. He would realize I was onto him. He and Jessica would immediately drain whatever remaining funds they had, pack their bags, and flee the state before the local authorities could secure a proper arrest warrant. I told Robert I did not just want to stop the sale and file a local police report. I wanted absolute devastating justice. I wanted to ensure that Richard and his young mistress could never escape, never hire expensive defense lawyers, and never see the outside of a prison cell again. I reminded Robert of the massive scale of their crime. Richard and Jessica had created a fraudulent limited liability company. They had orchestrated a fraudulent commercial real estate contract with an out-of-state development corporation. They were planning to receive $3.5 million across state lines via the electronic banking system. In the financial world, that is not a simple local dispute. That is a highly coordinated federal crime. I looked Robert straight in the eye and told him we needed to bypass the local police entirely. I told him we needed to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Specifically, we needed the White-Collar Financial Crimes Office. I am a professional accountant. My peers work at large corporate firms making six-figure salaries, enjoying benefits and comfortable lives. I could have had that life, but I chose to work freelance, taking on grueling, mind-numbing client portfolios late into the night, just so I could have the flexibility to help Richard. Robert stared at me for a long moment. A slow, brilliant realization dawned across his seasoned face. He understood exactly what I was building. He slowly pulled his hand away from the receiver of the desk phone. He opened his personal leather contact book and began flipping through the pages. Robert had spent decades practicing commercial law at the highest levels. He had a vast network of powerful connections. He found a direct private number for a senior special agent he had worked with on a previous corporate embezzlement case. He dialed the number and put the phone on speaker so I could hear everything. The line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. Robert identified himself and quickly explained that he was sitting with a client who possessed irrefutable documented evidence of an ongoing multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud conspiracy. He told the agent that the primary suspects were planning to execute the final stage of the crime in exactly 48 hours. The federal agent's tone instantly shifted from polite to intensely focused. He asked for the specific details. I leaned closer to the speakerphone. I introduced myself as a certified public accountant. I laid out the entire timeline with absolute professional clarity. I told the agent about my father's coma. I explained the forged quitclaim deed, the $10,000 bribe wired to the notary public, and the rapid creation of the Apex Holdings shell company. I told him that Richard and Jessica had a signed purchase agreement to sell the commercial plaza for $3.5 million to an out-of-state buyer. Finally, I told him the most critical piece of information. I told him the closing was scheduled for 9 o'clock this Friday morning at a downtown title agency where the fraudulent funds would be wired across state lines. The room was completely silent as the special agent processed the staggering amount of evidence I had just delivered. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with sharp predatory interest. In the world of federal law enforcement, catching white-collar criminals in the absolute middle of executing a multi-million-dollar wire fraud is the ultimate prize. The agent asked Robert if we had already filed civil injunctions to stop the sale. Robert explained about the lease pendants confirming the property itself was legally protected. But then I spoke up again. I told the federal agent that we wanted to set a trap. I proposed a secret alliance between my legal team and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told the agent that if we warned Richard now, he would run. I suggested that we allow the Friday morning closing to proceed exactly as planned. We would let Richard and Jessica put on their expensive business clothes and drive to the title agency completely unaware that the property title was already frozen. We would let them walk into that transaction room, sit down at the glossy conference table, and confidently smile at the real estate developers. I explained the ultimate legal trigger. The exact moment Richard and Jessica physically signed the final closing documents and officially requested the $3.5 million wire transfer, the crime of federal wire fraud would be perfectly undeniably complete. They would be caught absolutely red-handed, attempting to execute the theft in real time. The special agent agreed instantly. He loved the strategy. He told us that attempting to execute the wire transfer based on forged documents was more than enough to secure immediate on-the-spot federal arrests. He instructed Robert to securely send over all the digital evidence, the bank statements, the forged deed, and the sworn affidavit from Thomas. He told us that he was going to assemble a specialized task force immediately. He promised me that when Richard and Jessica walked into that closing room on Friday morning, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be waiting for them. Robert ended the call and hung up the phone. The heavy silence in the office felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of shock or despair. It was the calm electric silence that falls right before a massive storm. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline that had been keeping me upright for the past 12 hours was finally beginning to level out. I had done it. I had used my professional knowledge, my extreme attention to detail, and my utter refusal to be a victim to protect my father's legacy. I had taken Richard's perfect, arrogant plan and turned it into his own personal prison sentence. For 7 long years, I had been the unpaid financial backbone of his endless string of failing business ventures. When he wanted to start a tech consulting firm and blew through our initial savings, I was the one who managed the payroll, did the taxes, and balanced the books for free to keep us afloat. When that failed, and he insisted on opening an upscale organic market, I worked 20-hour days, auditing his disastrous inventory expenses, negotiating with angry vendors, and pulling from my own freelance income to pay our mortgage while he played the visionary CEO. Robert looked at me with profound respect. He told me he had never seen anyone navigate a crisis with such cold, terrifying precision. He said my father would have been incredibly proud of the warrior his daughter had become. Hearing him mention my father brought a fresh wave of sorrow to my chest, but I pushed it down. I could mourn my father properly when the war was truly over. I stood up and thanked Robert for his absolute loyalty and his brilliant legal maneuvering. I told him I was going to go back to my small secure hotel room and finally try to get some sleep. I knew the next 2 days were going to require every ounce of strength I possessed. I walked out of the law firm and back to my car. The rain had cleared, leaving the city air crisp and biting. I thought about Richard sitting in the house we had bought together, probably drinking an expensive glass of bourbon and laughing with his young mistress. I thought about Jessica, dreaming of the lavish millionaire lifestyle she thought she had successfully stolen from me. They had no idea that their entire future had just been completely dismantled in a quiet law office. They thought I was just a boring, predictable accountant who would blindly accept defeat and walk away quietly into the night. They completely failed to realize that people who spend their lives studying ledgers know exactly how to balance the scales. They had taken everything from me, and on Friday morning, the federal government was going to take everything from them. The trap was perfectly, flawlessly set. All I had to do now was wait for them to walk right into it. Friday morning broke with a crisp and biting chill that seemed to cut right through the glass of my hotel room window. The heavy, relentless rain from the previous days had finally moved on, leaving behind a pale and washed-out sky. It was a cold, unforgiving light that felt entirely appropriate for the brutal business I had to handle today. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the quiet room, staring at a woman who had completely transformed over the last 48 hours. The grieving, heartbroken daughter, who had been locked out of her own home in the freezing mud, was entirely gone. The betrayed, exhausted wife who had cried until she had no tears left was also gone. In her place stood a seasoned auditor, a woman who dealt exclusively in hard facts, cold numbers, and absolute accountability. I had armored myself for this final battle. I reached out and smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal gray suit. I had specifically chosen this exact outfit for today. It was sharp-structured and completely professional. It was the exact type of suit a woman wears when she's walking into a corporate boardroom to systematically dismantle a corrupt enterprise. I paired it with a crisp white blouse and simple, unassuming pearl earrings. My hair was pulled back into a tight, severe twist at the nape of my neck, ensuring there were no loose strands to distract me. My face was pale from the lack of sleep, but my eyes were steady and devoid of fear. I felt a profound, almost terrifying sense of calm wash over me. The chaotic panic of the past 2 days had crystallized into a singular, indestructible purpose. I was going to protect my father's legacy, and I was going to watch my husband's entire world collapse. I picked up my leather briefcase containing the copies of the forged deed, the bank wire transfers, and the sworn affidavit from Thomas. I walked out of the hotel and stepped into the brisk morning air. Robert Hayes was already waiting for me at the curb in his sleek black sedan. When I opened the passenger door and slid into the leather seat, Robert looked at me with a mixture of deep respect and quiet solidarity. He was dressed in his finest courtroom attire, a dark navy suit with a conservative striped tie. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply gave me a firm nod and put the car in drive. We drove through the waking streets of the city in complete silence. The traffic was light, allowing us to make excellent time toward the financial district. My mind raced through the meticulous preparations we had made over the last 36 hours. Every single variable had been accounted for. The trap was flawlessly set. We arrived at the towering glass and steel building that housed the premier commercial title agency in the city. This was the exact location Richard had chosen to finalize his massive theft. He wanted a high-end, legitimate setting to process the $3.5 million transaction, believing the glossy corporate environment would mask the stench of his fraud. Robert and I walked through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby. We did not go to the main reception desk. Instead, Robert guided me toward a private, secure corridor in the back of the building. We had coordinated this entire operation with the title agency's senior management and the federal authorities late last night. The title agent assigned to Richard's closing was fully aware of the situation and had been instructed to proceed normally until the very last possible second. We entered a small, dimly lit observation room that shared a discreet frosted glass partition with the main VIP conference room. Standing inside the observation room were three tall, imposing men in perfectly tailored plainclothes suits. They were the special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Financial Crimes Office. The lead agent, a man named Miller, with sharp eyes and a rigid posture, stepped forward and shook my hand. He quietly confirmed that the perimeter of the building was fully secured. Plainclothes agents were stationed at all the exits and in the underground parking garage. There was absolutely no avenue of escape. Agent Miller explained that they had successfully tapped into the conference room's internal audio system, allowing us to hear every single word spoken inside. We just had to wait for the targets to arrive, allow them to demonstrate their clear intent to execute the fraudulent wire transfer, and then move in to secure the arrests. I stood next to the frosted glass, my heart beating a slow, deliberate rhythm against my ribs. Through the translucent barrier, I could see the blurred outlines of the magnificent VIP conference room. It featured a massive polished mahogany table, plush cream-colored leather executive chairs, and a stunning panoramic view of the city skyline. A silver carafe of fresh coffee and a platter of expensive pastries sat on a side credenza. It was a room designed to make people feel wealthy, important, and completely invincible. It was the perfect stage for Richard's ultimate downfall. I had sacrificed my own career trajectory, my own peace of mind, and my own bank account to support his dreams. I had worn cheap clothes from discount racks so he could wear tailored suits and silk pajamas to his networking dinners. I had loved him with a blind, absolute devotion, believing that my sacrifice was an investment in our shared future. And now, while the dirt was not even dug for my father's grave, he was throwing my belongings into the mud. At exactly 8:45 in the morning, the heavy wooden doors of the VIP conference room swung open. Through the audio feed, I heard the bright, excessively loud sound of laughter. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, peering through the frosted blur as two figures walked into the room. It was Richard and Jessica. They looked absolutely euphoric. Richard was dressed in a brand new custom-tailored midnight blue suit that I knew he had purchased with the money he had drained from our joint accounts. His hair was perfectly styled, and he wore a heavy gold watch on his wrist. He carried himself with the swaggering, arrogant posture of a man who believed he had just outsmarted the entire world. Jessica was clinging tightly to his arm. She was wearing an elegant, form-fitting emerald green designer dress that screamed new money. Her hair fell in perfect, glossy waves over her shoulders, and she teetered on ridiculously high, expensive designer heels. They were holding hands, swinging their arms slightly as they walked, looking less like business partners closing a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deal and more like two giddy teenagers who had just pulled off a successful prank. The title agent, a calm and professional woman who had been fully briefed by the federal agents, greeted them warmly and offered them a seat. Richard pulled out a plush leather chair for Jessica with exaggerated gallantry before taking the seat right next to her at the head of the mahogany table. The title agent informed them that the representatives from the Real Estate Development Corporation were joining the closing via a secure video conference link and that the $3.5 million wire transfer was fully approved, sitting in escrow, and simply waiting for their final authorized signatures to be released into the Apex Holdings account. Richard beamed, flashing his perfectly white teeth at the title agent. He casually waved his hand and told her that was excellent news. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs and resting his ankle on his knee. He looked around the opulent room, sighing with deep theatrical satisfaction. I stood in the dark observation room, listening to his voice through the speaker, feeling a cold, hard knot of pure disgust form in my stomach. Jessica giggled, leaning her head against Richard's shoulder. She looked at the stack of legal documents resting on the table and sighed happily. Through the audio feed, her high-pitched, breathless voice filled the room. She told Richard that she could not believe they were finally here. She told him that she was so tired of wearing winter coats and dealing with the freezing city rain. She playfully slapped his arm and reminded him about the promise he had made to her the night before. Richard chuckled a deep, arrogant sound that made my skin crawl. He reached over and stroked her hand. He told her in a loud, boastful voice that he never forgets a promise. He leaned in closer to her, ensuring his voice carried across the room. He told Jessica that the very second the $3.5 million cleared into their offshore account, they were booking first-class tickets straight to Miami. He promised her that they were going to buy a massive, gorgeous villa right on the water. He started describing the house in agonizing, greedy detail. He talked about the private infinity pool, the sprawling marble patios, and the wrap-around balconies with unobstructed ocean views. He bragged that they would buy a sleek twin-engine boat and spend their weekends cruising the coastline, drinking expensive champagne, and leaving their boring, pathetic past lives far behind them. Jessica clapped her hands together in sheer delight. She told him he was an absolute genius. She loudly praised him for putting this entire deal together so quickly. She actually had the sickening audacity to mention my father. I listened in stunned, furious silence as Jessica casually remarked that it was a good thing Richard stepped in to handle the commercial plaza. She called my father a stubborn, outdated old fool who was wasting a goldmine of a property. She laughed and said that my father had held on to that dinosaur of a shopping center for decades, making pennies in rent, when he could have just cashed out and lived like a king. She told Richard that he was doing the property a favor by liquidating it. Richard nodded in profound, arrogant agreement. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He told Jessica that my father never possessed any real business vision. He said my father was a small-time thinker who dragged himself to work every day for no real reason. And then he mentioned me. Richard let out a dismissive, cruel scoff. He told Jessica that I was exactly like my father. He called me a boring, rigid, absolutely joyless accountant who cared more about balancing spreadsheets than living a real life. He proudly declared that I was completely blind to what was happening right under my own roof. He bragged about how incredibly easy it was to pack my bags, lock me out in the freezing rain, and take total control of the entire estate without me putting up a single shred of a fight. He told Jessica that I was probably sitting in some cheap motel right now, crying over my calculator, completely unaware that he had just secured their millionaire lifestyle. I stood in the observation room, listening to my husband systematically degrade my dying father and mock my very existence. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his arrogance was breathtaking. He believed he was an untouchable mastermind. He believed his deceit, his forgery, and his brutal emotional abuse were simply the necessary steps to claim a fortune he felt entitled to. He sat in that plush leather chair, breathing the conditioned air of a VIP suite, entirely consumed by his own monumental hubris. He had absolutely no idea that every single word he just spoke was being recorded by federal agents. He had no idea that the trap was closing around his throat. Agent Miller looked at me, his face hard and unreadable. He gave me a very slight validating nod. He knew exactly how painful it was to hear those words, but he also knew that Richard was digging his own grave with every arrogant syllable. "Richard, please." I begged, the icy rain dripping down my face, mixing with my hot tears. "Stop this. My father just died. I cannot do this right now. If you are angry about something, we can talk about it tomorrow. Just let me come inside." "Talk about it," Richard mocked, shaking his head. "There is nothing left to talk about, Sarah. The act is over. I am done playing the supportive husband to a nagging, penny-pinching calculator." The title agent smoothly interrupted their boastful celebration. She maintained her flawless professional composure. She slid a thick stack of papers across the polished mahogany table toward Richard. She placed a heavy, expensive silver pen neatly on top of the stack. She informed Richard that these were the final closing disclosures and the official wire transfer authorization forms. She explained that by signing these specific documents, he was legally verifying his identity as the sole authorized managing member of Apex Holdings, confirming the sale of the commercial plaza, and officially directing the title company to release the $3.5 million from the real estate corporation directly into his specified account. This was the moment. This was the absolute climax of his fraudulent scheme. This was the exact threshold of federal wire fraud. Richard did not hesitate. He did not read the documents. He did not ask a single legal question. He was entirely blinded by the promise of the cash. He reached out with a confident, sweeping motion and picked up the heavy silver pen. He clicked the top with his thumb. He gave Jessica one final triumphant wink. He pulled the closing disclosure closer to his chest and lowered the tip of the pen toward the signature line. Agent Miller raised his hands, signaling his team. Robert stood up straight, buttoning his suit jacket. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cold, hard armor of my gray suit settling around me. I pushed open the door of the observation room and stepped out into the main corridor. I walked with purposeful, unrelenting steps toward the heavy wooden doors of the VIP conference room. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who was about to deliver complete and total ruin. As Richard's silver pen made contact with the crisp white paper of the closing disclosure, I reached out and grabbed the brass handles of the conference room doors. I did not knock. I shoved the doors open with a violent, explosive force that sent them crashing loudly against the walls. The sudden deafening noise shattered the quiet luxury of the room. Richard flinched, his hand jerking upward, the pen slipping from his grasp and clattering sharply onto the mahogany table. Jessica let out a startled, high-pitched shriek, spilling her coffee across her emerald dress. I walked directly into the center of the VIP room. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, my posture commanding the entire space. I was impeccably dressed in my sharp gray suit, looking every inch the formidable auditor I was. Robert Hayes walked in immediately behind me, his face a mask of stern legal fury. And fanning out behind Robert, stepping smoothly into the room and blocking the exit, were the 3 plainclothes federal agents, their badges now clearly visible on their belts. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. All the arrogant laughter, all the boastful dreams of Florida villas and ocean views instantly evaporated into the cold, conditioned air. Richard stared at me. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. The smug, victorious smirk had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the pale, trembling realization that he was not an untouchable mastermind. He was just a thief who had walked blindly into a meticulously designed cage. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to find words that no longer existed. He looked at me, then at Robert, and finally at the 3 federal agents surrounding the table. I stumbled back a step, the shock radiating through my limbs. The act. You are throwing me out on the night my father dies. Where am I supposed to go? That sounds like a you problem, he sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. But you should probably get used to sleeping in your car. The pen lay abandoned on the unsigned paper. The $3.5 million remained locked safely in escrow. My father's legacy was secure. And as I stood there, in my gray suit looking down at the terrified man who had tried to destroy me, I knew that the absolute crushing weight of justice was about to fall. Every lie, every forged signature, and every cruel manipulation had led him directly to this exact second. The game was entirely over. I had won. The heavy oak doors of the VIP conference room hit the walls with a thunderous, explosive crash. The sound echoed through the massive room, instantly silencing Richard mid-sentence. For a fraction of a second, the entire room was absolutely frozen in time. Richard stared at me. His arrogant, triumphant smile dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was sitting at the head of the polished mahogany table, looking like a king who had just been violently dethroned. Jessica sat right next to him in her emerald green designer dress, her mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The heavy silver pen Richard was about to use to sign away my father's legacy slipped from his trembling fingers and rolled across the smooth wooden surface, clattering against a porcelain coffee cup. Richard blinked rapidly, desperately trying to process my physical presence. I was not supposed to be here. I was supposed to be weeping in a cheap motel, completely broken and defeated by his legal maneuvering. Instead, I stood tall in the doorway in my tailored gray suit, projecting absolute unwavering authority. The sheer panic in his dark eyes lasted only a moment before his narcissistic survival instincts forcefully kicked in. His shock morphed rapidly into a red, ugly rage. He slammed his hands flat on the polished mahogany table and pushed himself violently up from his plush leather chair. "What the hell are you doing here?" he yelled, his voice cracking slightly under the sudden immense pressure. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, desperately trying to regain control of the narrative and the room. "You have absolutely no right to barge in here. This is a private corporate meeting. Security! Someone call security and get this crazy woman out of this building right now." He looked wildly at the title agent who sat completely frozen at the other end of the long table. He demanded that she throw me out immediately. He shouted that I was his mentally unstable, estranged wife and that I was just trying to cause a massive scene because he was in the middle of leaving me. He desperately tried to project the image of a reasonable, wealthy businessman dealing with a hysterical, jealous spouse. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, trying to smooth out his rising panic. He looked at the two representatives from the Real Estate Development Corporation sitting across the table and offered a strained artificial laugh. He profusely apologized to them, claiming this was just a pathetic domestic dispute and promising that he would handle it outside so they could finish the wire transfer right away. But nobody moved to call the security guards. Nobody laughed with him. The atmosphere in the opulent VIP suite had fundamentally shifted from a celebratory closing to a suffocating interrogation room. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or cry or validate his desperate accusations. I simply stepped aside and let my lawyer, Robert Hayes, walk forward. Robert moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a seasoned predator who had finally cornered his prey. He walked straight toward the center of the conference room. He did not even glance at Jessica. He kept his sharp, calculating gray eyes locked directly on Richard. Richard took a hesitant step back, immediately recognizing my father's longtime attorney. The false bravado began to visibly leak out of his posture. Robert reached into his slim leather briefcase. He slowly pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, securely bound with a blue cover. He did not hand them to Richard. Instead, he tossed them forcefully onto the center of the polished mahogany table. The heavy thud of the paper landing right next to the unsigned closing disclosure sounded exactly like a judge bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. "That is a certified copy of a lis pendens, Robert," announced his voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal authority that commanded the entire room. It was officially filed and recorded with the county civil court at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. It places a full legally binding litigation injunction on this commercial plaza. Richard stared at the blue folder as if it were a highly venomous snake. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Jessica looked frantically back and forth between Richard and the legal documents, completely failing to understand the gravity of the situation. He stepped out onto the threshold, the porch light finally flicking on, casting harsh shadows across his angular face. He looked down at me, shivering and pathetic in the rain, and delivered the final devastating blow. Robert turned his attention away from Richard and directly addressed the title agent and the representatives from the Real Estate Development Corporation. He informed them in a crisp, highly professional tone that the commercial property they were currently attempting to purchase was the primary subject of an active, massive federal fraud investigation. He explicitly stated that the quitclaim deed Richard had utilized to transfer the property into the Apex Holdings shell company was a complete and total forgery. He announced clearly that we currently possessed a sworn notarized confession from the notary public, who was heavily bribed to falsify the signature of a man who was lying in a deep medical coma. The title agent gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The two representatives from the real estate corporation turned completely pale. In the commercial real estate world, a lis pendens linked directly to a federal forgery case is absolute poison. No title insurance company would ever underwrite the policy. No corporate buyer would ever risk $3.5 million on a stolen asset. The lead developer stood up, immediately pushing his leather chair back so hard it nearly tipped over. He looked at Richard with profound, unshielded disgust. He reached across the table and grabbed the certified bank check that had been resting near the closing documents. He firmly announced that the real estate corporation was officially withdrawing their offer and canceling the transaction immediately. He stated that they would absolutely not be a party to criminal fraud. He shoved the check into his briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and stepped entirely away from the table. The $3.5 million was officially gone. The massive payday Richard and Jessica had been salivating over had evaporated into thin air. I watched Richard's face as the true realization finally hit him. The remaining color drained completely from his cheeks until his skin was a sickly ashen gray. His chest heaved up and down as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The brilliant illusion of his flawless mastermind plan was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had absolutely nothing. He had no money, no property, and his elaborate escape route was entirely destroyed. Jessica finally understood that the millionaire fairy tale was over. Her emerald green designer dress suddenly looked incredibly ridiculous in the harsh, glaring reality of the room. She grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails, digging deep into the fabric of his expensive suit. She asked him what was happening. Her voice was shrill, loud, and incredibly panicky. She demanded to know where the money went and why the buyers were leaving the room. She asked him about the luxury villa in Florida and the first-class plane tickets to Miami that he had just promised her 5 minutes ago. Richard violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. The charming, sophisticated mentor act completely vanished, revealing the desperate, cowardly criminal hiding underneath. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy oak doors behind me. His primal survival instinct kicked into complete overdrive. He was entirely out of legal options, so he made the pathetic choice to physically run. He lunged forward, roughly pushing his way past the heavy leather chairs. He blindly grabbed Jessica by the wrist and dragged her stumbling toward the exit, determined to physically force his way out of the building. He yelled at Robert and me to get out of his way. He shouted that we could not prove a single thing, that it was simply his word against a disgraced, gambling-addicted notary, and that he was leaving right now. But he did not even make it halfway across the conference room. As Richard tried to sprint past me, the 3 plainclothesmen, who had quietly followed me into the room, smoothly stepped forward. They moved with incredible, highly coordinated speed. They instantly formed a solid, impenetrable wall of muscle and authority between Richard and the only doorway. Richard slammed hard into the chest of the lead agent. He bounced backward, stumbling clumsily over his own expensive leather shoes. He looked up, his face twisted in a mixture of blind panic and irrational anger, raising his fists as if he were actually ready to throw a punch. "I know exactly what happened at the hospital tonight, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a low, triumphant whisper. "And I also know about the will. Your father left you a commercial real estate fortune right in the heart of downtown, a prime plaza worth $4.7 million. The lead agent did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold badge, holding it up high for Richard and Jessica to see with absolute clarity. He introduced himself as a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically attached to the White-Collar Financial Crimes Division. He commanded Richard to stand completely still and keep his hands where they could be seen at all times. The mere mention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. Richard froze perfectly still. His entire body went rigidly stiff. The foolish urge to fight instantly drained out of his muscles, completely replaced by a deep, bone-chilling terror. He stared at the gold badge, his eyes incredibly wide and unblinking. The lead agent signaled to the other 2 agents with a slight nod. They stepped quickly around the mahogany table, flanking Richard and Jessica on both sides to prevent any further sudden movements. The room was absolutely silent, save for the ragged, panicked breathing of my husband and his mistress. The agent pulled a folded legal document from his inner pocket. His voice was loud, clear, and perfectly detached as he began to read from the official federal arrest warrant. He announced that Richard and Jessica were both being placed under immediate arrest. He looked directly at Richard and listed the devastating charges one by one. The words struck Richard like heavy physical blows. Forgery of federal documents, aggravated identity theft, conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud, and massive, premeditated tax evasion. The agent calmly explained that attempting to execute a multi-million-dollar wire transfer using a fraudulently obtained corporate entity across state lines carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Jessica let out a horrifying guttural scream. The crushing reality of the federal charges crashed down on her shoulders like a collapsing building. She was 24 years old, and she was suddenly facing decades behind steel bars in a federal prison. She realized in that exact second that she was not going to be sipping expensive champagne on a private yacht. She was going to be entirely stripped of her designer clothes and locked inside a cold concrete cell. The agent continued reading the warrant, officially informing them that their passports were completely revoked. He stated that all of their personal bank accounts, explicitly including the hidden offshore accounts they had planned to use for their escape, had been completely frozen by a federal judicial order less than an hour ago. Every single avenue of escape, every dollar they thought they had been systematically blocked and destroyed. I stood quietly near the door, my hands folded calmly in front of me. I watched the man who had promised to love and protect me completely and totally unravel. I felt absolutely no pity for him. I felt no sorrow for the life we used to have. I only felt the pure cleansing fire of absolute justice. He had tried to steal my father's entire life work. He had tried to leave me with absolutely nothing but grief and crushing debt. Now he was the one who had absolutely nothing left to his name. When a trapped animal realizes there is no escape, it will gladly chew off its own leg to survive. When two greedy, soulless criminals are caught red-handed facing decades of federal prison time, they will instantly and viciously tear each other apart. Jessica broke first. The glamorous, condescending mistress who used to smirk at me across my own dining room table completely lost her mind. She turned on Richard with the terrifying ferocity of a wild animal. She burst into violent, hysterical tears, her heavy makeup running down her pale face in dark, ugly streaks. My heart stopped. How did he know about the plaza? My father had kept his real estate investments strictly confidential, a quiet nest egg he had built over 40 years of frugal living and smart investments. He had only told me about the true value of the property a week ago, when his condition rapidly declined. Richard saw the shock on my face and his smile widened, exposing his teeth. She screamed at Richard at the absolute top of her lungs. She lunged at him, her hands clawing desperately at his face and his expensive midnight blue suit. She scratched his cheek hard, leaving a bright red bleeding mark across his skin. She yelled that he was a disgusting liar and a horrible monster. She screamed wildly to the federal agents that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forgery. She pointed her shaking finger directly at Richard's chest and blamed him for absolutely everything that had happened. She shouted that the entire scheme was entirely his idea from the very beginning. She claimed Richard had constantly told her the plaza was legally his and that his wife was just a crazy, jealous woman trying to ruin his successful life. She cried that Richard had promised her millions of dollars, a brand new luxury car, and a massive mansion in Florida. She sobbed uncontrollably, claiming that she was just a naive, innocent girl who had been cruelly manipulated and completely deceived by her wealthy older boss. She begged the federal agents to let her go, promising over and over to testify against Richard in federal court if they would just give her full immunity. Richard desperately tried to push her away, raising his arms to shield his scratched face from her flailing nails. He yelled at her to shut her mouth, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He called her a greedy, gold-digging leech. He shouted loudly to the agents that she knew exactly what they were doing the entire time, and that she had happily and willingly helped him set up the fraudulent shell company to hide the money. The sophisticated, untouchable mastermind and his beautiful, elegant muse were reduced to two pathetic, desperate criminals fighting and screaming in the middle of a corporate conference room. The federal agents moved in swiftly to end the embarrassing struggle. Two agents grabbed Jessica firmly by the arms, pulling her aggressively away from Richard. They spun her around, forcing her hands behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed brightly and clearly in the large room. Jessica collapsed heavily toward the floor, sobbing uncontrollably and pleading for her mother as the cold metal locked securely around her wrists. Richard stood completely alone in the center of the room. His custom-tailored suit was torn and rumpled from the fight. His face was scratched and bleeding slightly. His perfectly styled hair was a disheveled mess. He looked completely and utterly defeated. He looked at the lead federal agent stepping toward him with a gleaming pair of steel handcuffs. His knees finally buckled under the immense crushing weight of his new reality. He collapsed onto the plush carpet, falling heavily and loudly to his knees. His entire body shook with violent, uncontrollable tremors. He raised his hands, holding them out in front of him, his wrists trembling violently as he offered them up to the federal agent. The agent grabbed his arms firmly and secured the handcuffs tightly behind his back. Richard let out a loud, pathetic, broken sob. He looked up from the floor, his red, swollen eyes frantically searching the room until they finally locked onto me. I stood completely still in my gray suit, looking down at him from across the room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the total destruction of a man who had freely chosen greed and betrayal over basic human decency. Richard crawled forward slightly on his knees, his face twisted in a pathetic mask of pure desperation. The Tears streamed heavily down his cheeks, mixing with the blood from his scratch. He looked at me with wide, begging, pleading eyes. He begged me to help him. He begged me to tell the federal agents to drop the charges and let him go. He told me he was incredibly sorry for everything he had done. He said he was not thinking straight, that the massive pressure of his failed businesses had made him temporarily crazy. "Sarah, please," he whimpered, his voice a pathetic, broken, unrecognizable rasp. "Please, do not let them take me away to prison. Please, Sarah. We are husband and wife. We promise to be together for better or for worse. I love you. Please save me from this." He actually tried to use our marriage as a protective shield. He tried to invoke the sacred vows he had completely and intentionally destroyed. He thought he could manipulate my emotions one final desperate time. He truly thought the woman he had married was still weak enough, still naive enough to show him an ounce of mercy. "You thought you were so smart, keeping those documents tucked away," he taunted. "But you are naive, Sarah. You always have been. Your dad left you a $4.7 million commercial real estate empire. But after tonight, it is mine." I shook my head, my mind refusing to accept the sheer audacity of his claim. "You are crazy," I stammered, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You cannot touch that property. It is in my name. It is my inheritance. You have no legal right to it." I looked down at his tear-stained face. I thought about my father lying completely alone in a cold hospital morgue. I thought about the freezing rain soaking through my thin wool coat as I stood shivering on the porch of the home I had paid for. I thought about the sheer terrifying arrogance he had displayed just 10 minutes ago when he was happily planning to buy a luxury boat with my family's stolen money. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, devastating, absolute clarity that cut right through his pathetic sobbing and echoed off the walls of the large conference room. "You ended this marriage yourself the night you threw me out into the rain." I did not say another single word to him. I slowly turned my back on him. I listened to the sound of Richard screaming my name in pure agony as the federal agents hauled him forcefully up from the carpet and dragged him toward the heavy oak doors. I listened to Jessica sobbing hysterically as they led her away down the hallway. I listened until the heavy doors clicked shut behind them and the room finally fell perfectly, beautifully silent. The federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan was an imposing fortress of solid gray stone and highly polished marble floors. Walking through those heavy brass doors on the first day of the official sentencing hearing, I felt a profound sense of closure beginning to deeply take root in my soul. I was wearing the exact same charcoal gray suit I had worn on the day of the initial arrests at the title agency. It had become my personal, indestructible armor. Robert Hayes walked closely beside me, his presence acting as a steady, reliable anchor in the chaotic sea of complex legal proceedings. We took our seats in the front row of the wooden gallery, positioned directly behind the prosecution table. The air in the massive courtroom was incredibly cold, smelling faintly of lemon polish and aged legal documents. I looked across the wide central aisle toward the defense table. Richard sat there flanked by two appointed federal defense attorneys he clearly despised. He looked absolutely terrible. His custom-tailored midnight blue suits were gone forever, replaced by a drab, extremely ill-fitting beige prison uniform. His hair, once so perfectly styled and constantly maintained, was thinning rapidly and had turned completely white at the temples. He was no longer the arrogant, swaggering millionaire who had cruelly locked me out of my own home in the freezing mud. He was a pale, trembling shell of a completely broken man. His shoulders hunched forward, his eyes darting nervously around the large room. Sitting a few feet away from him at a separate defense table was Jessica. She looked completely unrecognizable without her heavy foundation and tight designer clothes. She wore the exact same drab beige uniform, her hair tied back in a messy, unkempt knot. They did not look at each other at all. The toxic, incredibly greedy alliance they had formed to steal my father's legacy had completely imploded the exact moment the cold steel handcuffs clicked around their wrists. The trial itself had moved with a terrifying, undeniable speed over the past few weeks. Federal prosecutors do not bring a major case to a jury unless they have absolutely irrefutable evidence, and we had handed them a flawless, meticulously documented blueprint of the entire financial crime. I had watched quietly from the gallery as the lead federal prosecutor methodically dismantled every single pathetic lie Richard and Jessica had ever told. It was an absolute masterclass in financial accountability and precise legal execution. The prosecutor had projected the raw bank statements onto a massive digital screen for the jury to examine closely. There was the $10,000 wire transfer, the undeniable concrete bribe paid directly from our joint bank account to Thomas. Then came the forged quitclaim deed, complete with the illegal notary seal shining brightly on the overhead projector. The 12 members of the jury stared at the financial documents, their faces hardening with absolute visible disgust. But the most devastating moment of the entire criminal trial came when the prosecution played the audio recording I had bravely captured on my front porch. My husband's cruel, boasting voice had echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous courtroom. The jury heard him brag about taking the commercial plaza and leaving me with absolutely nothing. They heard him explicitly mock my deep grief while my father was actively dying in the hospital. They heard the pure psychopathic greed dripping from every single spoken syllable. I saw several jurors physically shake their heads in complete disbelief. Then Thomas took the witness stand. He looked utterly broken as he swore a solemn legal oath to tell the absolute truth. He testified in agonizing, highly precise detail about the early morning hours in the intensive care unit. He described exactly how Richard had physically forced a plastic pen into my dying father's limp hand. He openly confessed to stamping the forged real estate documents in exchange for a briefcase full of stolen cash. His testimony was the final, completely devastating blow. Richard's defense attorneys tried to cross-examine him, but they had absolutely nothing to work with. The facts were carved in solid stone. The financial paper trail I had expertly uncovered was completely indestructible. It did not take long for the jury to reach a final unanimous verdict. They returned to the courtroom in less than 4 hours, finding both Richard and Jessica completely guilty on all federal charges of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. Today was the official sentencing hearing, and it was a day I will replay in my mind for the rest of my natural life. The presiding federal judge was a stern, highly uncompromising woman who had clearly run out of patience for greedy white-collar criminals. She addressed Jessica first. Jessica stood up slowly, her entire body shaking violently under the bright courtroom lights. She tried to play the role of the innocent, manipulated victim one last time. She wept openly in front of the judge, pleading for mercy and claiming she was just a young, naive girl. She stated over and over again that Richard had cruelly manipulated her into participating in the massive real estate scheme. My father, William, was gone. Richard chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Legal rights are just pieces of paper, sweetheart. And I have always been very good with paperwork, especially when my diligent accountant wife leaves her files lying around. He took a step backward into the warm, illuminated hallway of the house I had paid for with my endless nights of freelance auditing. She begged for a lenient sentence of simple home probation, swearing she would never do anything illegal again. But the judge was entirely unmoved by the theatrical, desperate tears. The judge looked down at Jessica from the high wooden bench and stated that willful ignorance and blind greed were not valid legal excuses for participating in a massive federal conspiracy. She specifically reminded Jessica of the digital text messages recovered from her mobile phone by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Those recovered messages showed Jessica eagerly discussing spending the stolen $3.5 million on luxury tropical vacations and expensive designer homes, while a good man was actively dying in a hospital bed. The judge loudly declared that Jessica was a willing, enthusiastic, and highly calculating participant in the attempted financial destruction of my family. The sentence was handed down with cold mathematical precision. 7 years in a federal penitentiary. Jessica let out a loud, absolutely heartbroken wail as the armed federal marshal stepped forward to physically escort her out of the courtroom. She looked back at me over her shoulder one last time, her eyes wide with absolute crushing terror, finally realizing that the glamorous, wealthy life she thought she had stolen was permanently gone forever. She was going to spend the remainder of her 20s locked securely inside a barren concrete cell. Then it was Richard's turn to face the absolute terrifying consequences of his supreme arrogance. He was forced to stand before the federal judge. He did not cry or scream like Jessica did. He just stared blankly ahead at the wooden bench, completely paralyzed by the horrifying reality of his grim situation. The judge did not hold back a single ounce of her judicial fury. She delivered a scathing, highly public condemnation of his entire moral character. She told him that his calculated actions were among the most depraved and callous financial crimes she had ever presided over in her long judicial career. She stated clearly for the official court record that he had disgustingly exploited his own father-in-law in his absolute most vulnerable moments on earth. She highlighted the undisputed fact that he had weaponized his marriage, deeply betrayed the woman who had financially supported him for years, and actively bribed a desperately addicted family member to blindly bypass the laws of the state. The judge looked Richard directly in the eye and told him that his sheer, unadulterated arrogance had completely blinded him to the reality of the modern legal system. He truly believed he was infinitely smarter than everyone else in the room, but he had left a trail of financial evidence so glaringly obvious it was almost pathetic for an auditor to uncover. For the severe charges of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit forgery, the judge sentenced Richard to 20 years in federal prison. 20 incredibly long years. There is absolutely no early parole or time off for good behavior in the federal penitentiary system. He would serve every single solitary day of that massive sentence. He would be an old, completely broken and entirely forgotten man by the time he ever saw the outside world again. Richard slumped forward heavily, resting his sweaty forehead on the edge of the defense table. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His brilliant, untouchable illusion was completely dead. The federal marshals pulled him roughly to his feet and clamped heavy steel chains around his wrists and his ankles. As they led him down the center aisle toward the holding cells, he passed right by my seat in the gallery. I did not say a single word to him. I simply looked at him, my face a perfect, unreadable mask of complete professional indifference. I wanted him to see that I was not broken or destroyed by his cruel betrayal. I wanted him to know with absolute concrete certainty that the boring, rigid accountant he had openly mocked was the exact reason he was going to die in a prison cell. Thomas faced the federal judge last. Because of his full, immediate cooperation with the authorities and his absolute willingness to testify openly against the true mastermind of the operation, the federal prosecution had agreed to a highly generous plea deal. The judge acknowledged his pivotal, necessary role in bringing Richard and Jessica to justice, but she did not let him off entirely without consequence. Thomas was formally sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation and was permanently and entirely stripped of his notary public license. He was also legally ordered to pay full and complete restitution for the $10,000 bribe he had initially accepted from our joint account. He walked out of the courtroom a technically free man, but he would carry the deep public shame and the severe legal restrictions for the rest of his natural life. His massive gambling debts still waited for him on the outside, but he would have to face them without the ability to forge legal documents ever again. The entire scheme of the villains was completely crushed by their own monumental arrogance and their profound ignorance of the law. But the absolute most important victory of the entire day did not involve lengthy prison sentences or cold steel handcuffs. After the criminal proceedings officially concluded, Robert and I walked out of the federal building and drove directly to the county civil court division to finalize the complete recovery of my father's vast estate. Based entirely on the overwhelming federal criminal convictions and the absolute documented proof of forgery, the civil court judge completely and immediately nullified the fraudulent quitclaim deed. The judge legally struck the illegal transfer from the official county records, entirely dissolving the Apex Holdings shell company into nothingness. The judge then signed a formal binding legal decree ordering that the $4.7 million commercial plaza be returned completely intact to its sole rightful and legal owner. That owner was me. I stood in the quiet marble hallway of the county courthouse, holding the certified legal document tightly in my hands. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy, carrying the profound weight of my father's 40 years of incredibly hard work, his endless personal sacrifices, and his deep, profound love for his only daughter. The tears that I had carefully held back and compartmentalized for months finally fell, streaming down my cheeks in a quiet, beautiful, and totally cleansing release of emotion. Robert placed a warm, highly comforting hand on my shoulder. He told me that my father would be incredibly proud of the immense strength, professional intellect, and personal resilience I had shown in the face of absolute evil. I looked down at the legal document, realizing the absolute undeniable truth of the entire situation. Richard and Jessica had built their entire criminal scheme on a fragile, hollow foundation of pure arrogance and profound ignorance of complex financial law. They foolishly believed that forged pieces of paper and quick, untraceable bank transfers were enough to easily steal a lifetime of generated wealth. They did not understand that a true legacy is built on unwavering integrity, grueling hard work, and the absolute refusal to ever be a passive victim. They thought they could casually bypass the law, but the law, fueled by their relentless methodical pursuit of justice, had entirely and completely crushed them. "Now gather up your wet rags and get off my property," he commanded, his voice hardening into a sharp, authoritative bark. "If you are still on this driveway in 5 minutes, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Before I could utter another word, before I could scream or demand an explanation for his insane threats, Richard reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle. "Goodbye, Sarah," he said. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright, incredibly warming afternoon sunlight. The freezing rain and the dark, terrifying nights of betrayal were finally completely behind me. I had successfully protected my family name. I had permanently secured my financial future. And as I looked up at the clear, beautiful blue sky, I knew I was finally ready to begin living the wonderful, highly successful life my father had always intended for me. It has been exactly 1 year and 2 months since the heavy doors of the federal courthouse closed and sealed Richard away from the rest of the world. Time is an incredibly remarkable healer. The passing of the seasons has slowly washed away the toxic residue of his presence in my life. I stand here today on a bright, crisp Tuesday morning. The air is incredibly fresh and smells faintly of roasted coffee and blooming marigolds. The sky above New York is a brilliant, endless expanse of clear blue, completely devoid of the dark, heavy rain clouds that seem to constantly shadow me during those terrifying days of betrayal. I am standing on the freshly paved sidewalk, looking up at the massive, beautifully illuminated sign that proudly arches over the main entrance of the commercial property. The sign reads William Plaza in bold classic lettering. It is named after my father. It is a permanent public monument to the man who gave me everything. I take a deep, grounding breath and let the vibrant energy of the morning wash over me. The plaza is absolutely bustling with life. I poured my entire heart, my soul, and a significant portion of the recovered funds into a massive top-to-bottom renovation over the past 12 months. When the civil court officially returned the $4.7 million estate to my sole ownership, the property was suffering from severe neglect. Richard had only ever viewed this place as a quick, illegal payday. He had let the maintenance contracts lapse. He had ignored the struggling tenants. He had allowed the physical foundation of my father's hard work to slowly decay. But I refused to let his greed be the final chapter of this property. I hired the best local commercial architects and honest construction crews. I spent countless late nights sitting at my kitchen table, meticulously reviewing blueprints and material costs, using the very same accounting skills that helped me uncover Richard's massive federal wire fraud. I watch a young mother pushing a stroller into the newly opened family bakery on the corner. The sweet, comforting scent of fresh bread and warm cinnamon rolls drifts out through the open glass doors, mingling with the crisp morning air. The central unit, which had sat dark and entirely empty for 2 long years under Richard's pathetic mismanagement, is now a thriving independent bookstore. I can see the owner arranging a display of new novels in the bright display window. Down the walkway, the local pharmacy and the neighborhood hardware store are busy serving regular customers. Every single storefront is fully occupied by honest, dedicated, hardworking people. They are exactly the kind of people my father always respected and supported. My father was a man who profoundly believed in the inherent dignity of honest labor. He came from absolutely nothing and built this commercial center brick by brick through sheer unrelenting determination. I can still clearly remember the rough-hardened calluses on his large hands. I remember the comforting smell of sawdust old paper and strong black coffee that always seemed to cling to his heavy winter jacket. He did not just own this land, he truly loved it. He knew the first name of every single tenant who ever rented a space from him. He asked about their children and their families. He often forgave a late rent payment when times were incredibly tough because he fundamentally believed in supporting his community. He taught me the true value of $1, but more importantly, he taught me the absolute value of personal integrity. Richard never possessed a single ounce of that integrity. Richard only saw numbers on a spreadsheet that he could secretly manipulate, drain, and steal to fund his own selfish, narcissistic gratification. He looked at my father lying completely helpless in a hospital bed and saw nothing but a vulnerable target. He looked at me, his loyal and devoted wife, and saw nothing but an incredibly naive, boring obstacle standing in the way of his millionaire fantasies. He thought I was just a quiet accountant who would easily surrender to his cruel, emotional abuse. He thought my inherent kindness and my deep desire for a peaceful family life were fatal weaknesses. He was completely and utterly wrong. The deep betrayal I experienced cut me more profoundly than I ever thought humanly possible. When the man you promised to spend your entire life with turns out to be a ruthless monster, willing to forge legal documents over the body of your dying father, it completely shatters your fundamental understanding of the world. For a short, terrifying period of time, I felt entirely lost. I felt like the solid ground had been violently ripped out from underneath my feet. The dark nights I spent alone in that cheap hotel room, terrified of what the future held, were the hardest moments of my entire existence. But I did not stay down. The crushing grief did not completely consume me. The burning anger and the profound humiliation did not poison my spirit. Instead, those dark emotions became the raw, powerful fuel that powered my absolute survival. I used my professional education. I used my meticulous, detail-oriented nature as a certified public accountant. I used the unwavering, indestructible moral compass that my father had carefully instilled in me since I was a little girl. I quickly realized that my quiet, unassuming demeanor was not a weakness at all. It was actually my absolute greatest tactical advantage. Richard completely underestimated me because I did not scream, throw things, or act out in public hysterics. He underestimated me because I was a loyal wife who had always trusted him to handle the business networking. He learned the absolute hardest way imaginable that a quiet, intelligent woman defending her family legacy is the most dangerous and unstoppable force on earth. Now Richard is sitting inside a barren concrete federal prison cell serving a mandatory 20-year sentence. He has no expensive tailored suits. He has no luxury cars. He has absolutely no access to the millions of dollars he desperately tried to steal. He is entirely stripped of his dignity and his freedom. Jessica is locked away in a separate federal penitentiary, her youth and her beauty wasting away behind thick steel bars because of her own blinding greed. Thomas, the cowardly notary public who sold his legal oath for $10,000, is living a disgraced life on strict federal probation, completely ruined by his own foolish choices. The entire criminal enterprise they built together collapsed spectacularly under the crushing weight of their own monumental arrogance and their profound ignorance of the law. They believed they could bypass the rules, but the truth always leaves a permanent paper trail. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a thunderous final crack that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a sharp metallic thud. Then the porch light flicked off, plunging me back into the freezing, relentless darkness of the storm. Standing here today, feeling the warm, beautiful sunshine on my face, I am filled with a profound and absolute sense of peace. The dark, suffocating shadows of deceit and manipulation have been entirely banished from my daily life. I am no longer just a surviving widow navigating a tragic loss. I am no longer a betrayed wife reeling from a massive domestic shock. I am the sole, undisputed, and incredibly proud owner of my own destiny. I am the fierce guardian of my family legacy. I have successfully built a wonderful, highly secure, and deeply fulfilling life entirely on my own terms. The millions of dollars in my bank accounts are completely safe. But the true wealth I have discovered is the absolute freedom and strength residing in my own heart. I wake up every single morning in a beautiful, quiet home that belongs entirely to me. I make my own coffee, I review my own business contracts, and I answer to absolutely no one but myself. I have completely reclaimed my life, and I have transformed a terrible tragedy into a magnificent, thriving triumph. I look at the bright letters of William Plaza one last time before turning to walk back to my car. I know my father is looking down at me today, incredibly proud of the woman I have become. I did not let his hard work vanish into the pockets of a greedy thief. I stood my ground. I fought with cold logic and undeniable facts, and I emerged completely victorious. The journey was incredibly painful, but it was absolutely necessary to burn away the lies and reveal the incredible strength I always carried inside me. Betrayal can come from the person you trust the most, but the law, calmness, and courage will be our women's sharpest weapons. It is never too late to stand up and reclaim what is rightfully yours. If you find this story inspiring, please like and subscribe to my channel to support me. Do not forget to leave a comment, letting me know which state you are watching this video in and at what time. Your strength is my greatest motivation. Thank you, and see you again. I stood there on the wet concrete, the rain soaking me to the bone, surrounded by my scattered, ruined clothes. My father was dead. My husband had just discarded me like garbage. And my family's legacy, the only thing my father had left me to ensure my safety in this world, was somehow in the crosshairs of a man I now realized I never truly knew at all. I did not fall to my knees. I did not scream at the locked door. At that moment, the naive, devoted wife died, and the cold, calculating mind of an auditor took over. If Richard thought he could steal $4.7 million from an accountant, he was about to learn a very painful lesson in forensic mathematics. I did not fall to my knees on that wet concrete. I did not pound my fists against the heavy oak door or scream Richard's name into the freezing night. The woman who would have done that died the moment the deadbolt clicked shut. Instead, I stood up straight. The icy Pennsylvania rain lashed at my face and soaked through my thin wool coat, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the absolute ice forming in my veins. I reached down and grabbed the broken handle of my cheap suitcase. The wheels dragged through the mud and wet leaves as I made my way down the driveway. Every step away from that house was a step away from the illusion of my 7-year marriage. I walked toward my old Honda Civic parked on the street. It was a reliable, unglamorous car. I had driven it for nearly a decade because every spare dollar we had went into Richard's flashy business ideas and his luxury leased vehicles. I unlocked the car door, threw the muddy suitcase into the back seat, and slid behind the steering wheel. The interior of the car was freezing, smelling faintly of stale coffee and old paper. I hit the lock button, securing myself inside this tiny cold metal box. Outside, the rain pounded against the windshield with a relentless, deafening roar. I reached into the back seat, grabbed a thick fleece blanket I kept for emergencies, and wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders. My teeth were chattering so hard my jaw ached. I sat in the darkness, staring through the rain-streaked glass at the house I had helped pay for. The master bedroom light flicked on. Richard was probably getting ready for bed, perfectly warm and comfortable, in his expensive silk pajamas, believing he had just won the ultimate prize. He thought he had discarded a useless, grieving woman. He thought I was weak. He was wrong. I reached into my soaked leather purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It was slightly damp on the edges, but the documents inside were safe. I carefully slid out the crisp white pages of my father's last will and testament. My hands trembled not just from the biting cold, but from the fresh, agonizing wave of grief that washed over me as I saw his familiar, rigid signature at the bottom of the page. He had slipped away just an hour ago, in a sterile, brightly lit hospital room, his rough, hard-working hand finally turning cold in mine. I am 34 years old. As a freelance accountant, I have spent my entire adult life making sure everything balances. I find comfort in spreadsheets, in clear columns of credits and debits, in the predictable logic of numbers. But death does not balance. There is no equation to solve the sudden gaping hole left by the man who raised me single-handedly. My father, William, was a man of few words and immense dedication. He did not inherit wealth. He built it with his bare hands, working 60-hour weeks for 40 years. The crown jewel of his life's work was a commercial shopping center right in the heart of downtown. It was not some glossy corporate mega mall. It was a bustling, vibrant local plaza. It had a beloved family diner, a busy hardware store, a local pharmacy, and a bakery that smelled like vanilla and fresh bread every morning. That plaza was his legacy. He knew every tenant by their first name. He fixed their leaky roofs and gave them grace periods on their rent when times were tough. A week before he passed away, when the doctors told us his heart was failing rapidly, he pulled me close to his hospital bed. He told me the property had recently been appraised at $4.7 million. He told me it was fully paid off, generating a steady, robust income. And he told me that he was leaving it entirely to me, his only child. He had looked into my eyes and told me he wanted me to be safe. He wanted me to have financial security, so I would never have to rely on anyone else. He wanted me to step away from my grueling freelance accounting work and finally live a comfortable life. And now my husband was claiming that $4.7 million legacy belonged to him. I traced the raised seal on the legal document with my thumb. The profound, suffocating pain of losing my father began to mingle with a deep-seated, toxic rage. The sorrow was pushed aside by a burning need for justice. I wiped the tears from my cheeks with the back of my hand. I am a certified public accountant. My entire career is built on tracking assets, verifying ownership, and understanding the complex flow of capital. My rational brain kicked into high gear, cutting through the emotional fog. A multi-million-dollar commercial property cannot just change hands because a husband locks his wife out of their house. Real estate transfers require a mountain of paperwork. They require deeds, notarized signatures, title searches, and legally binding contracts. Richard could not simply declare the property his. He had to have a pre-planned, meticulously executed legal scheme. He had been planning this. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity. This was a calculated, cold-blooded heist. I stopped crying completely. The tears dried up, replaced by a laser-sharp focus. I reached up and turned on the car's interior dome light. The dim yellowish glow illuminated the cramped space. I opened the glove compartment, pulled out a small flashlight, and clamped it between my teeth. Then I grabbed my phone and my planner from my purse. I needed to find the trail. Richard was arrogant, but he was not a financial genius. He was sloppy with numbers. That was why he always relied on me to do his bookkeeping. He used my skills to cover his tracks in his failed businesses, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he must have used my skills to steal my own inheritance. I opened my phone and went straight to my email and banking apps. I started scrolling through the past 3 months of transactions, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I pulled up the shared folder where we kept our household bills and scanned the documents. I needed to see what I had missed while I was consumed with my father's declining health. For weeks, my days and nights had been a blur of hospital visits, doctor's appointments, and endless worry. I had been exhausted functioning on 3 hours of sleep a night. Richard knew this. He knew I was vulnerable, distracted, and operating on autopilot. I began reviewing the endless text messages he had sent me over the last 2 months. I remembered times he would hand me a stack of mundane papers to sign, routine tax filings for his LLC, insurance renewals, banking authorization forms. He would casually slide them across the kitchen counter while I was frantically eating a piece of toast before rushing back to the intensive care unit. All I wanted, all I craved with every fiber of my exhausted being was to get home. I needed to walk through my front door collapse into the arms of my husband Richard and let him hold me together while I completely fell apart. I needed his warmth. I needed him to tell me that we would get through this terrible night, that I was not alone in the world. "Just sign these quickly, Sarah," he would say, kissing the top of my head. "It is just the usual quarterly stuff. I do not want you to worry about it while you are dealing with William." I had signed them. I had signed them blindly because I trusted him. I was an auditor who never signed a document without reading every clause, yet I had let my guard down in my own home. I kept digging through the digital files. My eyes scanned the bank statements for our joint account. Then I saw it, a series of small, seemingly insignificant charges that I had glossed over last month. A charge for an expedited courier service to a commercial real estate law firm. A strange filing fee paid to the county clerk's office. A payment to an independent notary public. I paid. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pieced the puzzle together. He had slipped property transfer documents or powers of attorney into those stacks of routine papers. He had used my own exhausted, trusting signature to legally bind me to my own ruin. He had paid a notary to stamp documents I had never properly acknowledged. He was setting up a shell company, a new LLC, right under my nose using the very household funds I was earning. The sheer scale of his betrayal was breathtaking. He had watched me cry over my dying father, held my hand in the hospital waiting room, and then gone home to orchestrate the theft of my father's life work. He had smiled at me while systematically dismantling my future. I spent the next 4 hours in that freezing car, mapping out every suspicious transaction, taking screenshots, and building a mental spreadsheet of his fraud. The cold seeped into my bones, making my joints ache, but I did not stop. I reviewed the property tax records online using my phone's cellular data. I looked up the corporate registry for the state. I found a newly registered limited liability company. It was formed just 3 weeks ago. The registered agents were listed, and the pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. The anger inside me solidified into a weapon. Richard thought I was just a naive wife who would be paralyzed by grief and fear. He thought throwing me out into the rain would break my spirit. He completely forgot that I am a woman who tracks missing pennies for a living. If someone tries to hide $4.7 million from me, I will tear their financial world apart ledger by ledger. As I finished compiling the digital evidence, the heavy rain finally began to slow, turning into a light, misty drizzle. I looked up from my phone screen. The sky in the east was beginning to turn a pale, bruised shade of purple and gray. The long, agonizing night was finally over. The sun was rising, casting a cold, harsh light over the suburban street. I looked at the house one last time. It looked completely different to me now. It was not a home. It was a crime scene. It was a monument to 7 years of lies and manipulation. I felt absolutely no attachment to it anymore. I did not want the house. I did not want the furniture. I only wanted justice, and I wanted my father's legacy back. I took the thick fleece blanket off my shoulders and folded it neatly. I packed my father's will and my notes safely back into the manila envelope and zipped it securely inside my leather purse. I adjusted the rearview mirror and looked at my reflection. My face was pale, my eyes were red and swollen from the tragedy of the hospital. But my expression was harder than stone. The terrified, grieving girl from the porch was gone. I turned off the main road and navigated the winding tree-lined streets of our quiet suburban neighborhood. The houses were dark, their occupants tucked away in warm beds, oblivious to the fact that my entire universe had just shattered. I pulled into our driveway, the tires crunching softly on the wet gravel. The porch light was off. The house was completely dark, save for the faint bluish glow of the street lamp reflecting off the living room windows. I turned the key in the ignition. The old Honda engine sputtered for a second before roaring to life. I turned on the heater, letting the warm air blow over my frozen hands. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back at the house. I did not shed another tear for Richard. I drove through the waking streets of Pennsylvania, the morning light reflecting off the wet pavement. I knew exactly where I needed to go. I bypassed the police station. This was not a simple domestic dispute. This was a complex, high-stakes financial crime, and I needed someone who knew how to navigate the absolute highest levels of commercial law. I drove straight toward downtown, heading for the imposing glass and steel building that housed the law offices of Robert Hayes. Robert was not just any attorney. He was a brilliant, ruthless litigator who had been my father's personal lawyer and trusted friend for over 20 years. He was the man who had drafted the very will sitting in my purse. He knew my father's wishes perfectly, and he knew the exact value of the commercial plaza. I navigated the early morning traffic, my mind calculating the next moves. I needed to lock down the assets. I needed to freeze the accounts. I needed to file emergency injunctions before Richard could completely liquidate the property or transfer the title out of reach. I knew the legal window to stop a fraudulent transfer was incredibly narrow. Every minute counted. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the law firm just as the clock on the dashboard read 7:30 in the morning. I knew Robert always arrived at his office by 7:45, a habit my father had always admired. I grabbed my purse, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the elevators with purposeful, unwavering steps. The lobby of the law firm was quiet, the receptionist just turning on the lights. She looked surprised to see someone so early, especially a woman in damp clothes holding a manila envelope like a shield. But I did not hesitate. I walked straight up to the heavy mahogany desk. I need to see Robert Hayes right now. I told her, my voice echoing in the quiet lobby. Tell him William's daughter is here, and tell him we have a multi-million-dollar fraud to stop. The battle for my father's legacy had officially begun, and I was ready to bring Richard's entire world crashing down. The heavy glass doors of Robert Hayes' law firm felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds as I pushed my way inside. The quiet carpeted lobby was a stark contrast to the chaotic, freezing rain I had just driven through. The air smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint, bitter scent of black coffee. Martha, the receptionist, who had worked for Robert since I was a little girl in braided pigtails, looked up from her polished oak desk. Her warm, welcoming smile vanished the second she saw my face. My clothes were damp and wrinkled. My hair was plastered to my cheeks. My eyes were red and swollen from a night of unspeakable grief and betrayal. I did not need to say a word for her to know that my world had completely collapsed. I walked straight up to her desk and told her I needed to see Robert immediately. I told her my father had passed away in the night and that I was facing an absolute emergency. Martha did not ask a single question. She picked up her desk phone, pressed a button, and spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. Less than a minute later, Robert stepped out of his corner office. Robert was a man in his late 60s, a brilliant, seasoned litigator with sharp grey eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had been my father's closest confidant, his golf partner, and his legal advisor for more than 2 decades. He knew every tenant, every lease agreement, and every single brick of the commercial plaza my father had spent his entire life building. When Robert saw me standing there, trembling and clutching my leather purse like a shield, his stern professional demeanor instantly softened. He ushered me into his large office, closed the heavy mahogany door behind us, and guided me to one of the plush leather chairs across from his desk. I sat down and finally let the words out. I told him my father was gone. Robert closed his eyes, taking a long, deep breath as the weight of the news settled over him. He offered his sincerest condolences, his voice thick with genuine sorrow for the loss of his old friend. But I did not have the luxury of sitting there and mourning. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark car for a moment, listening to the rain hammer against the metal roof. I was shivering, chilled to the bone, my clothes damp from the frantic run out of the hospital. I grabbed my purse, took a deep, shaky breath, and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The cold, calculating mind of an accountant had already taken over my grief. I looked Robert straight in the eye and told him exactly what had happened on my front porch just hours ago. I repeated Richard's exact words. I told him how my husband had locked me out in the freezing rain, smiled like the absolute devil, and declared that my father's $4.7 million real estate fortune now belonged to him. Robert frowned, his thick grey eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head firmly. He told me that was entirely impossible. Robert stated that he held the original legally binding will in his own fireproof safe. He assured me that my father had left the entire plaza to me and me alone as his sole heir. Robert confidently declared that Richard had no legal standing, no ownership rights, and absolutely no way to claim that property. But I am a certified public accountant. I have spent my entire career tracking missing assets, untangling corporate fraud, and auditing chaotic financial ledgers. I know better than anyone that documents can be manipulated and systems can be bypassed if someone is greedy enough and desperate enough. I pulled the damp manila envelope from my purse, took out the notes I had frantically scribbled in my car, and placed them on Robert's desk. I told Robert that Richard was not bluffing. I explained that Richard was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to lock me out of my own home unless he already had a legal shield in place. I begged Robert to log into the county database right that second. I needed to see the public records. I needed to know exactly what my husband had done while I was sitting in a hospital room watching my father take his final breaths. Robert saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. His professional instincts kicked in, replacing his sorrow with sharp, focused legal caution. He turned his leather chair toward his computer monitor and woke up the machine. He opened his web browser and navigated directly to the county clerk office portal, the official database where every real estate transaction, deed transfer, and property lien is recorded for the public record. The silence in the office became heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rapid rhythmic clicking of Robert's keyboard as he typed in the parcel identification number for my father's commercial plaza. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. As an auditor, I know the profound terror of waiting for a final balance sheet to load. You hold your breath, praying the numbers match the reality you believe in, knowing that a single discrepancy can ruin an entire business. This was not a client's business. This was my life. This was the legacy my father had built from nothing, working 60-hour weeks to ensure I would never have to depend on a man like Richard. I watched the loading icon spin on Robert's monitor. Each second felt like an agonizing hour. Suddenly, the clicking of the mouse stopped. I watched Robert's face. I saw the exact moment the color completely drained from his cheeks. His sharp gray eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He leaned closer to the screen, his mouth falling open in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. He did not say anything. He just stared at the digital records as if he were looking at a ghost. The silence stretched on, stretching my nerves to their absolute breaking point. I asked him what he saw. My voice was hoarse, barely more than a terrified whisper in the quiet room. Robert slowly turned his head to look at me. His expression was a mixture of professional shock and deep, visceral anger. He swallowed hard before he finally spoke. He told me that exactly 48 hours ago, a new set of legal documents had been electronically filed and officially recorded with the county clerk. My mind raced backward doing the brutal math of the timeline. 48 hours ago, 2 days ago, my father had just suffered a massive cardiac event. He had been rushed to the intensive care unit. He was entirely unconscious, breathing through a ventilator, trapped in a deep medically induced coma. I was sitting on a plastic chair in the hospital corridor, sobbing into my hands, praying for a miracle. Richard had been there with me. He had patted my shoulder, offered me a cup of terrible hospital coffee, and then told me he needed to run home for a few hours to grab us some clean clothes and take care of the dog. Richard did not go home to get clean clothes. He went to execute the final fatal stage of his heist. The icy water instantly soaked through my thin coat as I hurried up the concrete walkway to the front porch. My fingers were numb and clumsy as I dug through my purse, searching for my house keys. The metal jingled softly in the quiet night. I found the familiar brass key, stepped up to the heavy wooden door, and slid it into the deadbolt. I turned my wrist, expecting the smooth, familiar click. Instead, the key refused to budge. Robert turned the large computer monitor around so I could see the screen. He pointed a trembling finger at the 2 digital documents listed at the very top of the property ledger. The first document was a general durable power of attorney. The second document was a quitclaim deed. I stared at the bold black letters on the screen, feeling a wave of absolute nausea rise in my throat. As a financial professional, I knew exactly what those 2 documents meant when paired together. They were the ultimate legal weapons for transferring wealth quickly and quietly. Robert's voice was grim as he explained the horrific reality of the situation. He opened the digital file for the power of attorney. It was a comprehensive legal document that granted complete, unrestricted financial and legal authority over my father's affairs. It gave the designated agent the power to manage bank accounts, sign contracts, and most importantly, buy or sell real estate on my father's behalf. And right there on the bottom of the second page was the name of the appointed agent, Richard. My husband had somehow secured a document making him the absolute legal controller of my father's entire estate. But it was the second document that delivered the truly fatal blow. Robert clicked on the quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed is a specific type of real estate transfer. It does not offer any warranties or guarantees about the title. It simply transfers whatever ownership interest the current owner has directly to a new party. It is incredibly fast, requires very little verification compared to a standard warranty deed, and is almost exclusively used to transfer property quickly between trusted family members. Because it is an internal family mechanism, it rarely triggers immediate suspicion or red flags at the clerk's office. Richard had weaponized our marriage. He had weaponized his status as my husband and my father's son-in-law to bypass the standard legal scrutiny that would normally protect a $4.7 million commercial property. I read the details on the quitclaim deed, my eyes scanning the dry legalistic text that was systematically erasing my family's history. The document stated that my father, acting through his legally appointed agent Richard, was willingly and entirely transferring his full ownership of the commercial plaza. The property was not transferred to Richard's personal name. Richard was far too calculating for that. A direct transfer to himself would be easily contestable in a divorce proceeding. Instead, the deed showed that the property had been transferred to a mysterious limited liability company, an LLC. The name of the company was simple and completely untraceable at first glance. Apex Holdings, LLC. Robert sat back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He explained the sheer terrifying magnitude of the obstacle we were now facing. On paper, within the strict confines of the county legal system, this transaction looked completely legitimate. The clerk's office sees hundreds of quitclaim deeds filed every single week by family members managing estates for elderly parents. They look for valid signatures and proper notary stamps. If the paperwork appears correct on its face, they record it. Richard had presented a notarized power of attorney. He had signed the quitclaim deed as the authorized agent. He had paid the filing fees. The county had accepted it without a single question. Legally, as of 48 hours ago, my father no longer owned the commercial plaza he had spent 4 decades building. And because my father did not own it at the exact moment of his death last night, the property could not be passed down to me through his will. The will Robert held in his fireproof safe was now completely useless. It was a document dictating the transfer of an asset that no longer existed in my father's portfolio. Richard had essentially bypassed the entire probate process. He had stolen the property while my father's heart was still beating, ensuring that by the time I was a grieving orphan, I was also a destitute one. I sat in the leather chair feeling the walls of the elegant law office closing in on me. The sheer psychopathic brilliance of Richard's plan was suffocating. He had not just cheated on me or hidden money in a secret bank account. He had orchestrated a flawless, legally binding corporate takeover of my inheritance. He had exploited my trust, my exhaustion, and my father's coma. He had used his position as a family member to slide right past the legal safeguards designed to protect vulnerable people. The evidence was glaring brightly on the computer screen. It was an ironclad, monumental obstacle. To the outside world, to a judge, to the county clerk, Richard was a dutiful son-in-law managing a complex real estate portfolio for a dying man. To me, he was a monster who had smiled in my face while sliding a knife directly into my back. I frowned, wiping a mixture of rain and tears from my eyes. I pulled the key out, thinking I had inserted it upside down in the dark and pushed it back in. I twisted it again, putting a little more force into it this time. The metal ground against the pins, but the lock remained stubbornly jammed. But Richard had made one massive fundamental miscalculation. He believed that because he had successfully filed the paperwork, the war was over. He believed that I would collapse under the weight of the legal jargon, that I would accept defeat and walk away with nothing, just like he demanded on the porch. He forgot that I do not just read numbers. I dissect them. I am an auditor. I know that behind every fraudulent document, there is a trail of breadcrumbs. There is always a fake signature, a bribed notary, or a hidden bank transfer. I did not let the panic consume me. I looked away from the horrific quitclaim deed on the monitor and turned my gaze back to Robert. My tears were completely gone. My voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. I told Robert that Richard had just committed massive federal wire fraud, and I was going to prove it. I demanded that we immediately pull the state corporate registry. I needed to know exactly who was sitting behind the protective shield of Apex Holdings, LLC. I needed to know who was helping my husband steal my $4.7 million legacy. The legal system had been used to build a fortress around Richard's lies, but I was fully prepared to tear it down brick by brick. The heavy glass doors of Robert Hayes' law firm felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds as I pushed my way inside. The quiet carpeted lobby was a stark contrast to the chaotic freezing rain I had just driven through. The air smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint, bitter scent of black coffee. Martha, the receptionist, who had worked for Robert since I was a little girl in braided pigtails, looked up from her polished oak desk. Her warm, welcoming smile vanished the second she saw my face. My clothes were damp and wrinkled. My hair was plastered to my cheeks. My eyes were red and swollen from a night of unspeakable grief and betrayal. I did not need to say a word for her to know that my world had completely collapsed. I walked straight up to her desk and told her I needed to see Robert immediately. I told her my father had passed away in the night and that I was facing an absolute emergency. Martha did not ask a single question. She picked up her desk phone, pressed a button, and spoke in a hushed, urgent tone. Less than a minute later, Robert stepped out of his corner office. Robert was a man in his late 60s, a brilliant, seasoned litigator with sharp grey eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had been my father's closest confidant, his golf partner, and his legal advisor for more than 2 decades. He knew every tenant, every lease agreement, and every single brick of the commercial plaza my father had spent his entire life building. When Robert saw me standing there trembling and clutching my leather purse like a shield, his stern professional demeanor instantly softened. He ushered me into his large office, closed the heavy mahogany door behind us, and guided me to one of the plush leather chairs across from his desk. I sat down and finally let the words out. I told him my father was gone. Robert closed his eyes, taking a long, deep breath as the weight of the news settled over him. He offered his sincerest condolences, his voice thick with genuine sorrow for the loss of his old friend. But I did not have the luxury of sitting there and mourning. The cold, calculating mind of an accountant had already taken over my grief. I looked Robert straight in the eye and told him exactly what had happened on my front porch just hours ago. I repeated Richard's exact words. I told him how my husband had locked me out in the freezing rain, smiled like an absolute devil, and declared that my father's $4.7 million real estate fortune now belonged to him. Robert frowned, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head firmly. He told me that was entirely impossible. Robert stated that he held the original legally binding will in his own fireproof safe. He assured me that my father had left the entire plaza to me and me alone, that his sole heir. Robert confidently declared that Richard had no legal standing, no ownership rights, and absolutely no way to claim that property. But I am a certified public accountant. I have spent my entire career tracking missing assets, untangling corporate fraud, and auditing chaotic financial ledgers. I know better than anyone that documents can be manipulated and systems can be bypassed if someone is greedy enough and desperate enough. I pulled the damp manila envelope from my purse, took out the notes I had frantically scribbled in my car, and placed them on Robert's desk. I told Robert that Richard was not bluffing. I explained that Richard was arrogant, but he was not stupid enough to lock me out of my own home unless he already had a legal shield in place. I begged Robert to log into the county database right that second. I needed to see the public records. I needed to know exactly what my husband had done while I was sitting in a hospital room watching my father take his final breaths. Robert saw the absolute certainty in my eyes. His professional instincts kicked in, replacing his sorrow with sharp, focused legal caution. He turned his leather chair toward his computer monitor and woke up the machine. He opened his web browser and navigated directly to the county clerk office portal, the official database where every real estate transaction, deed transfer, and property lien is recorded for the public record. The silence in the office became heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the rapid rhythmic clicking of Robert's keyboard as he typed in the parcel identification number for my father's commercial plaza. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. As an auditor, I know the profound terror of waiting for a final balance sheet to load. You hold your breath, praying the numbers match the reality you believe in, knowing that a single discrepancy can ruin an entire business. This was not a client's business. This was my life. This was the legacy my father had built from nothing, working 60-hour weeks to ensure I would never have to depend on a man like Richard. I watched the loading icon spin on Robert's monitor. Each second felt like an agonizing hour.